Hey there, tonight we're diving into the cutthroat world of the Roman Senate, where the truth is, this political arena was less about lofty debates and more about a battlefield of backstabbing and intrigue. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now find your comfort zone, perhaps turn on a fan for that gentle background hum, and let's venture into tonight's story together. As the sun peeks over the horizon, casting its glow on the ancient city of Rome, you're about to step into the buzzing hive of political maneuvers known as the Roman Senate. It's 50 BCE, a time when Rome isn't just a city, but the epicenter of a sprawling empire. Now, before diving headfirst into the marble-floored chaos of Roman politics, let's set the stage. You're standing at the heart of a political arena that makes modern governments look like playground disputes over sandcastles. First, let's talk about the crowd you'll be mingling with. The Roman Senate is a who's who of power brokers, a gathering of roughly 600 men. Sorry, ladies, this was a strictly boys' club, each draped in togas that screamed serious business. These guys are the patricians, the elite class who run the show, but don't get too comfortable with visions of grandeur. The plebeians, the common folk, are always lurking in the backdrop, eager to seize any opportunity to topple the high and mighty from their thrones. Now, if you think stepping into your office politics is tough, try navigating the Senate's corridors of power. The place is a swirling vortex of ambition, where alliances are as fickle as a Roman summer breeze. One moment you're shaking hands with a senator over a shared interest, and the next he's plotting your political demise over a goblet of wine. Those togas, think less classic fashion statement and more ideal attire for hiding daggers. Speaking of daggers, let's not forget the economic backdrop fueling these political games. The Roman economy is a beast, driven by agriculture, trade, and let's not sugarcoat it, slavery. Grain from Egypt, spices from the East, and slaves from everywhere Rome's legions have set foot. It's a world where wealth and power are as intertwined as the marble pillars of the Senate itself. Rome's coffers are fat, but so is the appetite for more land, more control, more influence. In this bustling hub of power, every decision ripples out across the empire. Whether it's a matter of military campaigns or civic building projects, the Senate's decisions shape the lives of millions. But don't be fooled by the grandeur. This is no benevolent council of wise elders. It's more like a gladiator arena of words, where rhetoric is your weapon, and every senator is out for blood, or at least a hefty chunk of the political pie. Now, about those myths. The romanticized image of the Roman Senate is all about stoic philosophers debating the virtues of governance under the shadow of towering marble. In reality, it's less about philosophical debates and more about power plays. Senators don't just debate, they scheme, they bribe, and sometimes brawl. The Senate's history is littered with the ghosts of plots and betrayals, and the phrase "et tu, brute" didn't just pop out of thin air. To give you a taste of the drama, let's consider the political heavyweights of the time. Julius Caesar, Pompey the Great, and Crassus form the first triumvirate, a political alliance that's as much about mutual distrust as it is about shared power. Caesar's out in Gaul expanding Rome's borders and his own ego, while back in Rome, Pompey and Crassus are trying to keep the Senate in check. It's a delicate dance of power, where one misstep could send the whole empire into chaos. As you tighten your toga and prepare to wade into this den of intrigue, remember that the Senate is both the heart and the heartache of Roman politics. It's where laws are made, broken, and remade, often in the same breath. Senators gather in the Curia, the Senate House, a building that, despite its grandeur, is often packed to the rafters with men vying for influence, each one eager to leave his mark on history, or at least the nearest senator's back. So, as you step through those grand doors, take a deep breath. You're entering a world where words are as powerful as swords, and alliances are as binding as the thin fabric of your toga. Welcome to the Roman Senate, the stage where legends are made and unmade, often before the ink on the latest edict has dried. Here, history isn't just written, it's carved, debated, and occasionally rewritten with a touch of blood and betrayal. Keep your wits about you, you're going to need them. And just like that, you're plunged into the whirlwind of Roman Senate duties. where the daily grind isn't about clerking in and out, but about surviving a political battlefield. Let's break it down. You're part of an elite club that spends its days wrestling with the Republic's sprawling territories, debating laws that could sink or save entire provinces, and juggling the whims of unpredictable alliances. It's not exactly a 9-to-5 gig, more like a roller coaster ride, where the tracks are still under construction. First up, let's tackle the procedural chaos. If you think modern politics is a mess, the Roman Senate was where chaos got its postgraduate degree. The order of business was as predictable as a cat on caffeine. Senators would gather in the Curia, the Senate House, a space that, on a good day, was as organized as a toga party. Here, you'd find yourself elbow to elbow with men who could switch from calm debate to fiery rhetoric faster than you can say, Veni, Vidi, Vici. The agenda, often driven by the whims of whoever held the most sway at the time, like the presiding consul, who was less a neutral moderator and more a political puppeteer. The debate itself was a gladiatorial match of words. Forget about polite discourse. This was verbal warfare. Senators would stand, toga-clad and ready to unleash a torrent of persuasive oratory, or at least attempt to. The topics, anything from military campaigns to civic projects, but always with an eye on personal gain. Remember, every decision had a ripple effect, not just on the Republic, but on each senator's career, and they were all too aware of it. Now, the real kicker, managing Rome's vast territories. The Roman Empire was like a board game, with each province a piece that needed careful maneuvering. Picture this. You've got to manage everything from Britannia's drizzly shores to the sun-baked sands of Egypt. Communication, a nightmare that makes today's internet outages look like minor inconveniences. Messages took weeks, sometimes months, to reach their destination. Orders sent to a general in Gaul could change from "send reinforcements" to "send my regards" by the time it arrived. The logistical gymnastics were Herculean. But hey, this is Rome, classic overachievers. Now throw in the bureaucracy, a beast so convoluted it could make even the most seasoned senator weep. Every decision required layers of approvals, consultations, and often a healthy dose of bribery. Money talks, and in Rome, it often sang entire operas. The Republic's economy, driven by agriculture, trade, and the less than glamorous institution of slavery, was both a blessing and a curse. Sure, the coffers were full, but the hunger for more land, power, influence was insatiable. This brings us to the political alliances, more volatile than a Roman summer storm. Alliances were forged and broken faster than you could order a goblet of wine. One moment you're allied with a fellow senator over a shared interest, and the next he's plotting your downfall because someone else offered him a better deal. Case in point, the first triumvirate, a fragile alliance between Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus. Each man had his own agenda, and their agreement was less about camaraderie and more about strategic convenience. The Senate was their chessboard, and every senator a potential pawn or adversary. Now, let's bust a myth or two. The Senate might evoke images of philosophical debates under marble arches, but reality was more backroom deals than ivory tower deliberations. Yes, there were moments of grandeur, of statesmanship and eloquence, but these were often overshadowed by the gritty, cutthroat nature of Roman politics. Senators didn't just debate. They schemed, bribed, and occasionally brawled, all with the goal of securing their place in the annals of history, or at least maintaining their grip on power. So here you are, a cog in the grand machine of the Roman Senate, where every decision is fraught with complexity, and every alliance is a potential pitfall. It's a world where the stakes are high, the players are ruthless, and the outcome is as uncertain as the next roll of the dice. Welcome to the daily grind, Roman style. If you're not exhausted yet, just wait. It's only getting started. As you navigate this political labyrinth, let's pause for a moment and take a look at the not-so-glamorous side of Roman politics, the economy. You see, while the senators were busy playing a game of power chess, the real cost of Rome's grandeur was quietly gnawing at their heels. And when I say cost, I mean the kind that could make even the most hardened senator break into a sweat under his toga. Welcome to the midday crunch, where the true weight of Rome's empire hits like a cartload of amphorae. First off, let's talk taxes. Yes, those pesky little things that have been making people grumble since, well, forever. For Rome, taxes weren't just a way to fund the lavish lifestyle of its elite, or build yet another temple to a god with a name you can't pronounce. They were the lifeblood of the empire, a necessity to keep the sprawling territories from falling into chaos. But don't go picturing a streamlined IRS operation here. The Roman tax system was more like a tangled web of provincial governors, local collectors, and good old-fashioned corruption. Taxes were collected from provinces in various forms, grain, money, or goods, each with its own set of rules and naturally loopholes. Now, if you think dodging taxes is a modern innovation, think again. The rich had their ways of minimizing their contributions, and tax collectors weren't exactly known for their honesty. In fact, being a publican or tax collector was such a lucrative gig that bids for these positions were harder than a Roman midsummer day. The Senate, in its wisdom, would auction off the right to collect taxes in a province, and the highest bidder would then squeeze the locals for as much as they could without sparking a rebellion. It's a system that makes today's tax code look like a model of efficiency. Then there's the military, Rome's pride and joy, and its biggest money pit. Maintaining legions wasn't just about paying soldiers wages, though that was a hefty expense on its own. We're talking about outfitting them with armor, weapons, and let's not forget the essentials like food and sandals for those long marches across the empire. Roman soldiers were well equipped, and that came with a price tag. The annual cost of maintaining a single legion could run into millions of sesterces. Multiply that by the dozens of legions stationed across Rome's territories, and you're looking at a financial commitment that could keep any treasury official up at night. But wait, there's more. Rome also had a reputation to maintain. This was a city that prided itself on its public works, grand aqueducts, vast road networks, and monumental buildings that made the Colosseum look like a weekend DIY project. These weren't just vanity projects. They were statements of power and civilization. The Aqua Appia, one of Rome's earliest aqueducts, was built in 312 BCE and spanned a whopping 5 kilometers. Impressive, absolutely cheap, not in the slightest. Such feats required not only a labor force, often slaves, but also skilled engineers and architects who didn't come cheap. Public works were a brilliant investment in Rome's image and function, but they had to be paid for. This is where the senator's fiscal balancing act came into play. Imagine juggling flaming torches while riding a unicycle, and you get the idea. They had to ensure enough funds were allocated to appease the military, satiate the public's demands for bread and circuses, and still have enough left over to line their own pockets. Because, let's face it, personal gain was always on the agenda. For every grand structure that stood as a testament to Roman engineering prowess, there was a senator somewhere trying to justify its cost. These projects required approval and funding, which meant debates, negotiations, and, inevitably, a few under-the-table deals. The Forum of Caesar, for instance, was a project that, while serving as a public space, also conveniently bolstered Julius Caesar's status. It cost an eye-watering amount, funded partly by the spoils from his conquests in Gaul, talk about turning blood into bricks. Here's a myth worth busting, the notion that Roman senators were altruistic public servants. In reality, their economic decisions were often driven by personal interests. Investments in public works weren't just about civic duty. They were opportunities to increase one's prestige and wealth. A senator backing a major project could expect kickbacks in the form of contracts for friends and allies, or even direct financial benefits. It was a system built on mutual back-scratching, and senators were only too happy to oblige. And let's not ignore the elephant in the room, or rather, the slave in the villa. Rome's economy leaned heavily on slavery, which was both a source of wealth and a societal pressure cooker. Slaves were the engine behind much of the agricultural output, especially in the large estates owned by the patricians. They were also crucial in construction, mining, and even domestic service. Yet, this reliance on slave labor was a double-edged sword. While it provided cheap labor, it also carried the constant risk of unrest. The Senate had to balance the benefits of this system against the potential for rebellion, a task that required both political acumen and a healthy dose of paranoia. This brings us to the fiscal tightrope senators walked daily. Rome's grandeur came at a cost, and the treasury was always in a delicate dance between surplus and deficit. Senators had to be masters of economic acrobatics, ensuring that the republic didn't stumble under its own weight. Yet, despite the challenges, the allure of power kept them in the game. The Senate's ability to project strength and maintain order across its territories was a testament to their skill in managing resources, even if it was occasionally at the expense of honesty and transparency. So here you are, knee-deep in the economic quagmire of the Roman Senate. It's a world where fiscal responsibility is both a necessity and a game, one where the stakes are as high as the ambitions of those who play it. As the sun reaches its zenith, casting long shadows across the forum, remember that each coin in the treasury is a testament to the Senate's prowess and its penchant for creative accounting. You're not just witnessing history, you're living it, one financial crisis at a time. The day isn't over yet, and the afternoon promises even more intrigue and maneuvering. Stay sharp, Senator. There's plenty more to come. As the sun reaches its zenith, casting long shadows across the forum, you can't help but notice how the Senate transforms into a theater of human ambition. Afternoon sessions in the Roman Senate are where the real drama unfolds. Less C-SPAN and more House of Cards on steroids. Forget the morning's tedious debates over grain tariffs. Now, it's time for the gladiatorial games of rhetoric, where social dynamics and personal rivalries take center stage. You're about to get a front row seat to the political equivalent of a high-stakes poker game, where the chips are reputations and the bluffs are as bold as Caesar's hairstyle choices. Let's dive into the social dynamics, shall we? The Roman Senate isn't just a collection of individual powerhouses. It's a web of family dynasties, each with its own agenda and history. Imagine if the Kennedys, Rockefellers, and a sprinkling of Kardashians were all vying for control over a continent-spanning empire. The patrician class, with its ancient lineage, is obsessed with lineage and legacy. Names like the Julii, Claudii, and Cornelii carry weight that can catapult a political career or sink it faster than you can say Cicero. Family names aren't just social currency, they're political battering rams. The right name can open doors, while the wrong one can shut them more effectively than a Senate decree. This is where patronage systems come into play, a mix of nepotism and mutual back-scratching that would make even modern politicians blush. A senator with an influential family name could expect a network of clients, those eager to curry favor for political or financial gain. In return, these clients offered loyalty votes, and sometimes a convenient scapegoat when things went south. It's a system that's equal parts loyalty and coercion, turning the Senate into a political mafia where everyone knows the cost of stepping out of line. But let's not romanticize these familial alliances too much. For every supportive uncle or cousin, there's an ambitious relative waiting in the wings with a dagger in one hand and a forged will in the other. Take the case of Lucius Sergius Catilina, better known as Catiline, who was a charismatic senator from a noble family, but also a man with a knack for scandals. Catiline's ambitious plot to overthrow the Republic in 63 BCE wasn't just a power grab. It was a testament to how personal rivalries could explode into full-blown conspiracies. His downfall was as much about personal vendettas as it was about political ideology. Then there's the matter of reputation, a currency more volatile than Bitcoin. In Rome, maintaining your public image was a full-time job. Senators would go to great lengths to uphold their honor, often resorting to bribery, propaganda, or, if all else failed, hiring a poet to sing their praises. A single scandal could ruin a career faster than a chariot crash during the Ludi Romani. Reputation wasn't just about ego. It was about survival in a world where public favor could flip like a Roman coin. Speaking of scandals, let's talk about a juicy one, the Bona Dea scandal of 62 BCE. This was a religious rite held in the house of the Pontifex Maximus, Julius Caesar at the time, and was strictly women only, no exceptions, not even for men in drag. But Publius Clodius Pulcher, ever the scandal seeker, decided to crash the party dressed as a woman. The resulting uproar was a PR nightmare for Caesar, who was forced to divorce his wife in an attempt to save face. The incident is a textbook example of how personal indiscretions could have far-reaching political repercussions. In Rome, your private life was public business, and the Senate was the ultimate gossip circle. And let's not forget the role of rhetoric in this drama. A silver tongue was worth its weight in gold, or sesterces in this case. Senators like Cicero wielded words like swords, able to sway the Senate with a well-timed oration. Cicero's speeches against Catiline, known as the Catilinarian orations, were masterpieces of persuasion, rallying the Senate against the conspirator. But rhetoric was a double-edged sword. A slip of the tongue could be as deadly as a slip of the dagger. All these factors make maintaining one's reputation both an art and a science. It's not just about staying out of scandals. It's about strategically aligning oneself with the right families, patrons, and allies. It's about navigating the tightrope of ambition without losing balance. It's about knowing when to speak up and when to let silence speak volumes. And above all, it's about ensuring that, when the political dust settles, you're still standing, and preferably standing taller than your rivals. So here you are, deep in the afternoon sessions of the Roman Senate, where the real power plays happen. It's a place where alliances are as fragile as the papyrus on which they are recorded, and where the stakes are as high as the columns of the Forum. Welcome to the social dynamics of Rome, where the game is less about who you are and more about who you can convince others you are. Keep your eyes open and your toga tighter. The day is far from over, and the stage is set for more political theatre. As the sun begins its descent over the 7 hills of Rome, casting a golden hue across the ancient city, the day in the Senate starts to wind down. But don't be fooled. The political machinations are far from over. This is the time for reflection, if you can call the mental gymnastics of a Roman senator reflection. It's more like a post-game analysis in a high-stakes chess match where every piece could stab you in the back. The pressures of being a Roman senator would make even the most seasoned modern politician break into a sweat beneath their power suit. First, let's talk about the mental toll of this political circus. The constant threat of downfall looms larger than the Colosseum itself. Unlike the gladiators who fought for survival in the arena, senators battled with words, alliances, and cunning stratagems. The stakes, political survival, and sometimes your actual life. Remember the infamous Julius Caesar himself, assassinated by his peers in 44 BCE. It's a grim reminder that in the Senate, enemies often wore the same toga as friends. The pressure was relentless. Senators faced the daily expectation of not only maintaining, but also expanding their influence. It was a cutthroat environment where every decision was scrutinized, every alliance questioned. Imagine trying to sleep at night, knowing that your rival's next move could be your last. The weight of expectations was heavier than a Roman legion standard, and the mental gymnastics required to stay ahead made the Olympic Games look like a leisurely stroll through the Forum. Physically, the life of a senator wasn't any easier. Sure, they weren't ploughing fields or marching in legions, but the long hours, constant debates, and formal events took their toll. The Senate sessions could last from dawn till dusk, with only brief respites for meals that were more about networking than nourishment. Senators had to be on their toes, literally and figuratively, ready to defend their positions or pounce on an opportunity. It was a grind that required stamina, not just in rhetoric, but in endurance. Then there's the historical impact of their decisions. While senators might have been consumed by personal gain, the ripples of their choices spread far and wide. Every edict, every law passed under those grand arches, had consequences for millions across the empire. From the grain supply that fed the Roman populace to the military campaigns that expanded its borders, the Senate's decisions shaped the course of history. It was a humbling thought, knowing that their actions today could echo through the annals of time. Or, spark a riot if the grain prices spiked. Yet, for all its grandeur and impact, the life of a Roman senator wasn't the glamorous affair Hollywood might suggest. Sure, there were moments of grandeur, of eloquent speeches that could sway the masses, but these were often overshadowed by the gritty reality of political survival. The romantic image of a noble senator debating the virtues of governance is lovely in theory, but the truth was far less poetic. It was more about who you knew, who owed you a favor, who you could outmaneuver. Let's bust one last myth, the idea that the Senate was a place of noble ideals and high-minded debates. While there were moments of philosophical brilliance, they were often punctuated by bribery, backstabbing, and the occasional brawl. Senators were less philosopher kings and more political gladiators, fighting for survival in a world where loyalty was as rare as a snowstorm in Sicily. As the day draws to a close and the senators file out of the curia, the weight of their roles is palpable. They carry the burden of expectations, the pressure of maintaining their positions, and the constant threat of political collapse. It's a world where reputation is everything, where the wrong move can end a career or a life. In the end, Being a Roman senator was less about glory and more about survival. It was a reminder that the past isn't just a series of dates and events, but a tapestry of human ambition, folly, and resilience. So, here we are at the end of a senator's day, a mix of triumph and exhaustion, where the only certainty is uncertainty. The legacy of the Roman Senate is one of power and intrigue, a testament to the complexity of human nature and the enduring impact of history. As you drift off to sleep, remember that the echoes of those ancient debates still resonate today, a reminder that while the players may change, the game remains timeless. Rest well, because if history teaches us anything, it's that tomorrow is always another day in the Senate. The air in Eisenach, Germany, in 1685, must have been filled with music, or at least that's how it seems when you peek into the life of Johann Sebastian Bach. Born into a family where musical talent was more common than a cold in January, Bach had an upbringing that was anything but ordinary. Imagine a world where family reunions resemble an impromptu symphony more than awkward small talk. That's the Bachs for you, a musical dynasty stretching back generations, each member seemingly born with a treble clef in hand. Now, Eisenach wasn't exactly the bustling metropolis of musical innovation, but it did have something going for it, the Bachs. Johann Sebastian was the youngest of 8 siblings, and his father, Johann Ambrosius Bach, was a court trumpeter who probably saw musical notes the way most of us see grocery lists. For the Bachs, music was not just a career, it was the family language, and young Johann was practically marinating in it. But let's not pretend that Johann's early years were all about serenades and lullabies. Tragedy struck early when he was just 9 years old. His parents died within months of each other, leaving him an orphan. Enter Johann Christoph Bach, his older brother, who took in young Johann and became his first music teacher. There was no Spotify or YouTube back then, just the drudgery of copying sheet music by hand. Johann's brother had a collection of sheet music that was more off-limits than a teenager's diary. Of course, our young prodigy snuck in at night to copy it by moonlight, a story that sounds like the rebellious antics of a rock star rather than a future Baroque composer. As Johann matured, so did his musical prowess and his rebellious streak. Fast forward to his teenage years, and you've got a young man who's not just fiddling with instruments, but downright obsessed. Picture this, a 20-year-old Johann deciding to walk 280 miles from Arnstadt to Lübeck to hear the legendary organist Diederich Buxtehude. Yes, you heard that right, 280 miles. Today, people whine about walking half a block to the coffee shop, but Bach was hoofing it across Germany just to hear a concert. It's like a road trip, only without the road or the trip. This wasn't a quick weekend getaway either. Bach was supposed to take a few weeks' leave from his position as an organist at the new Kirche in Arnstadt, but he extended his stay to over 3 months. His supervisors were less than thrilled about his extended absence, and when he finally returned, they were ready with a list of grievances longer than a Baroque fugue. Bach had a penchant for playing overcomplicated compositions during church services, much to the dismay of the congregation who probably just wanted a quick hallelujah and not a full-blown concert. But here's the kicker. Bach didn't just extend his trip for the heck of it. No, he was learning, absorbing like a sponge. And when he returned, he brought back with him the musical innovations he had gleaned from Buxtehude. He was a walking, talking, organ-playing prototype for the modern-day artist who pushes boundaries and refuses to color within the lines. Johann Bach's early life was a symphony of contrasts, a young man grounded in a solid, albeit tragic, family foundation, yet constantly pushing against the boundaries set before him. He was a musical rebel with a cause, and his cause was nothing short of revolutionizing the way music was perceived and played. This was a guy who saw the rules of music not as a prison, but as a playground. And it is this spirit that set the stage for his later works, which would ripple through centuries of music, influencing everything from classical to jazz, to rock and roll. As we delve deeper into his life, remember that Bach was more than just a name on a sheet of music. He was a living, breathing testament to the power of innovation, an embodiment of the idea that sometimes you've got to march to the beat of your own drum, literally. In the world of classical music, Johann Sebastian Bach was the original rock star, only his stage was an organ loft, and his fans, well, they were every musician to come after him. Now, let's slide into the next chapter of Bach's life, where the real-world pressures of adulting hit hard, and being a musical genius didn't exactly pay the rent. Fasten your seatbelts, folks, because we're heading to Weimar, where Bach's career was less of a meteoric rise and more of a roller coaster of court politics and personal drama. In 1708, Bach snagged a gig as the court organist and chamber musician under Duke Wilhelm Ernst of Weimar. You could say it was a step up from his previous post, but not exactly a red carpet affair. Weimar wasn't a bustling metropolis. It was a small, influential court that offered Bach a platform to showcase his skills while also locking him into a game of political chess with aristocratic patrons. Here's the kicker. The Duke paid him a salary of 150 florins a year. For perspective, that's like an entry-level paycheck in the tech industry today, without the stock options. Bach's tenure at Weimar was marked by both artistic triumphs and, let's say, professional hiccups. On the upside, he expanded the organ repertoire and composed some of his early masterpieces, including the famous Toccata and Fugue in D minor. You know, the one that sounds like it should accompany Dracula's dramatic entrance. But on the downside, the court was a hotbed of intrigue, and our man Bach had a knack for stepping on the wrong toes. His patron, Duke Wilhelm Ernst, was a man who valued loyalty and obedience, two qualities that didn't exactly gel with Bach's go-it-your-own-way attitude. And speaking of stepping on toes, let's not forget the infamous spat with the Duke's nephew, Ernst August. Bach's loyalty, or lack thereof, between these two feuding relatives would later come back to haunt him, but more on that drama in a bit. By 1717, Bach had had enough of Weimar's political quagmire and was ready to take his talents elsewhere. Enter Prince Leopold of Anhalt-Köthen, a young, music-loving aristocrat who offered Bach a promising new position. The salary, a sweet 400 thalers a year, nearly triple what he was making in Weimar. Now, that's what you call an offer you can't refuse. But hold your applause. Getting out of Weimar wasn't as simple as packing up his sheet music and hopping on a carriage. Bach's departure from Weimar was less of a graceful exit and more of a dramatic escape scene. Duke Wilhelm Ernst, not one to easily let go of his prized organist, threw Bach in jail for almost a month. Yep, you heard right. Our musical maestro was locked up for daring to resign. It wasn't exactly Alcatraz, but it was enough to make Bach realize that high-level negotiations sometimes required a bit of groveling. Eventually, after a stint behind bars that would make any rock star proud, Bach was released and allowed to head to Köthen. Now, Köthen was a breath of fresh air, both literally and metaphorically. The court was Calvinist, meaning they didn't require the elaborate church music Bach was known for, leaving him free to focus on instrumental compositions. This was the golden period when he composed the Brandenburg Concertos, acknowledged today as some of the finest orchestral works in the Western canon. But let's not gloss over the fact that even in this seemingly idyllic setting, life threw Bach some curveballs. Prince Leopold may have been a great supporter, but he also spent a lot of time traveling, leaving Bach to face the realities of court life without a steady audience. And then there was personal tragedy. Bach's first wife, Maria Barbara, died unexpectedly in 1720 while he was away with the prince. This loss was a heavy blow, hitting him harder than a timpani. Still, Bach's resilience was nothing short of legendary. In 1721, he married Anna Magdalena Wilk, a talented soprano 17 years his junior. Their union was not just a personal triumph, but also a professional collaboration. Anna Magdalena became an integral part of Bach's musical life, helping him with his compositions and performances. Their partnership was a testament to Bach's ability to bounce back from adversity and adapt to life's ever-changing rhythms. Throughout his career, Bach navigated the tricky waters of patronage, where the whims of the aristocracy could make or break a musician's career. He balanced creative ambition with the need for a steady paycheck, a dance that any freelancer today would recognize. His time in Weimar and Köthen was marked by the kind of struggles that remind us that behind every legendary composer is a human being juggling personal dreams with professional realities. As we continue our journey through Bach's life, remember that the man behind the music was constantly negotiating with the world around him. He was a pioneer, an innovator, and yes, a bit of a rebel. But most importantly, He was a survivor, navigating the highs and lows of life with a tenacity that would leave a lasting mark on the world of music. Stay tuned, because there's much more to uncover about this extraordinary life. And so, with the ink barely dry on his resignation from Cöthen, our man Bach finds himself in Leipzig, a city that was to be both his muse and his nemesis for the next 27 years. Now, if you're thinking Leipzig was the 18th century version of Nashville for composers, think again. Leipzig was more like an academic pressure cooker, the kind of place where creativity had to politely shake hands with academic bureaucracy. Bach arrived in 1723 to take on the role of Tamascantor, which sounds fancy until you realize it was a job that came with more hats than a royal wedding. He was responsible for music at the city's 4 main churches, teaching at Tammerschule, and composing a constant stream of music. Talk about a gig economy. Leipzig was no musical paradise. It was a city of merchants and scholars, a place where the church and academia held the reins. Bach's salary was a respectable 100 florins a year, plus some allowances that could total around 700 florins, but he earned every last coin. The job came with a house, but it wasn't exactly a penthouse suite. With a family that eventually grew to include 20 children. Yes, 20. It was more of a human Tetris puzzle. Imagine a household where the sound of scales on a keyboard was as regular as the ticking of a clock. Now, let's talk about the Tammerschule, the educational institution where Bach spent a significant chunk of his time. This wasn't your average school. It was an institution that could trace its roots back to 1212, making it older than some countries. Bach was essentially the head music teacher, but his duties extended well beyond plucking out a few tunes. He had to oversee the entire music program, which involved everything from teaching Latin to disciplining unruly students. Yes, our musical genius was also a part-time disciplinarian, likely with a stern glare that could silence a rowdy classroom faster than you can say, fugue. But Bach's tenure in Leipzig wasn't just about keeping students in line. He composed some of his most enduring works here, including the St. Matthew Passion and the Mass in B minor. These weren't just compositions. They were monumental achievements that redefined sacred music. While today, these works are celebrated as masterpieces, in Bach's time, they were a mix of genius and necessity. He had to churn out new music for church services with the regularity of a Netflix series release schedule. Each week brought with it new demands, and Bach delivered, week after week, like a musical machine with a human soul. Yet, life in Leipzig wasn't all about music. Bach had to navigate the murky waters of church politics, an arena where diplomacy was as crucial as musical talent. The city council and church officials were the literal gatekeepers of Bach's career, and they had no qualms about letting him know who was in charge. Bach's relationship with them was often fractious, a tug-of-war between artistic freedom and bureaucratic control. At times, it must have felt like composing music with one hand tied behind his back. And let's not forget the economic backdrop. This was the early 18th century, a time when Europe was recovering from the War of the Spanish Succession, and money wasn't exactly flowing like the Rhine. Bach had to be savvy, not just in music, but in managing finances. The cost of living in Leipzig wasn't low, especially with a brood like Bach's. He supplemented his income by offering private music lessons and selling his compositions, the 18th century equivalent of a side hustle. Despite these challenges, or perhaps because of them, Bach's creativity flourished. His music from this period is a testament to his resilience, a living proof that pressure sometimes creates diamonds. The well-tempered clavier was born in Leipzig, a collection of preludes and fugues in all 24 major and minor keys, a technical marvel and a pedagogical tool rolled into one. It's the kind of work that makes you wonder if Bach ever slept, or if he was fueled solely by coffee and the endless demands of his job. Bach's personal life during his Leipzig years was a whirlwind of highs and lows. His marriage to Anna Magdalena was a partnership in every sense. She was not only a supportive wife, but also a musical collaborator, copying scores and undoubtedly offering critiques. With her, Bach fathered 13 children, adding to the 7 he had from his first marriage. Sadly, only 10 of his children survived to adulthood, a stark reminder of the harsh realities of 18th century life. So, what do we take away from Bach's Leipzig chapter? Here was a man juggling more responsibilities than a modern startup CEO, yet he managed to compose works that still resonate today. He was a master multitasker in an era when multitasking wasn't even a concept. He balanced the demands of teaching, composing, and navigating church politics while maintaining a household more chaotic than a reality TV family reunion. In the end, Bach's Leipzig years were a masterclass in perseverance and ingenuity. They remind us that genius isn't just about talent. It's about grit, tenacity, and the ability to thrive in the face of constant challenges. Bach wasn't just composing music. He was composing his life, one note at a time, in a city that demanded nothing less than his very best. And though his time in Leipzig was fraught with pressures and politics, it was also a period of extraordinary creativity that would leave an indelible mark on the world of music. But hold onto your powdered wigs, because the story of Bach doesn't end here. There are more notes to play, more tales to spin, and more layers to uncover in the life of Johann Sebastian Bach. Stay tuned as we dive deeper into the world of this musical titan, where every note tells a story, and every story reveals a new facet of genius. So, as we peel back the layers of Johann Sebastian Bach's Leipzig life, we find a man who wasn't just crafting music, but essentially juggling a dozen flaming batons while riding a unicycle. Yet, despite the chaos, Bach produced works that would echo through the corridors of time, even if his immediate neighbors were more likely to echo complaints about all the noise. Now, let's tackle a juicy myth, the idea that Bach was the toast of his own time. Spoiler alert, his contemporaries didn't exactly shower him with bouquets. In fact, during his lifetime, Bach was more like a niche artist than a chart topper. Sure, the musical cognoscenti nodded in approval, but your average 18th century Joe was probably more interested in the latest operatic gossip or a catchy folk tune than one of Bach's intricate fugues. Why was Bach not the Baroque equivalent of a pop sensation? Well, for starters, his music was the auditory equivalent of a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle. It required focus, dedication, and a taste for complex harmony. This wasn't music for casual humming. It was for those who enjoyed a bit of mental gymnastics with their listening experience. Imagine trying to get through a Bach cantata while your buddy next door is blasting the 1720s version of top 40 hits. Not exactly a fair fight, but let's be real, Bach wasn't entirely ignored. He had his fans, like Frederick the Great of Prussia, who was something of a groupie for anyone who could handle a harpsichord. But outside these circles, Bach's music was often considered too cerebral, too demanding. Even his role in Leipzig was less about personal glory and more about meeting the expectations of his employers and the church. At the end of the day, the man had bills to pay and mouths to feed, 20 of them, to be precise. Jump forward a few decades after Bach's death in 1750, and you'll find his music languishing in the shadows, like an old vinyl record gathering dust in the attic. For a good 50 years, he was all but forgotten, his compositions quietly shelved, while Europe moved on to the classical period, with its simpler, more elegant forms. But wait, the plot thickens. Enter the hero of our story, Felix Mendelssohn. In 1829, Mendelssohn orchestrated a performance of Bach's St. Matthew Passion in Berlin, setting off a Bach revival that would make any publicist proud. Suddenly, Bach was back, and this time it was personal. Mendelssohn's concert was like the original viral hit, sparking newfound interest in Bach's works and cementing his place in the musical pantheon. But why the sudden turnaround? The 19th century was ready for Bach. Romanticism was all the rage, and people were craving depth, complexity, and a touch of the divine in their music. Bach's compositions, with their intricate structures and emotional layers, fit the bill perfectly. It was as if listeners had finally caught up to what Bach had been doing all along. Fast forward to today, and Bach's music is everywhere, from concert halls to ringtones, from movies to meditation playlists. His work is as likely to appear on a classical music station as it is to lull a baby to sleep. And that's the delicious irony. The man who wasn't universally adored in his own day is now a universal staple, soothing souls and challenging musicians worldwide. But let's not romanticize too much. Bach's newfound fame came with a side of myth-making, painting him as a sort of divine musical prophet. While there's no denying his genius, it's crucial to remember that he was also a man of his time, navigating financial pressures, and personal losses like the rest of us. His legend grew not just from his work, but from the shifting tastes and cultural currents of later generations who chose to see him as a towering icon. In peeling back the layers of Bach's story, we uncover a man whose legacy was less about immediate acclaim and more about enduring impact. He was a musician who wrote not for fame, but for the sheer joy of creation, a sentiment that transcends the centuries. His music was a gift to the world, even if it took the world a while to unwrap it. So, as we continue to explore the life and times of Johann Sebastian Bach, remember that the real magic lies not just in the notes he composed, but in the way those notes continue to resonate, challenging our minds and touching our hearts. There's more to come in this symphony of a story, so stay tuned as we delve deeper into the life of a man whose music was destined to be heard, even if he had to wait a bit longer than expected for his standing ovation. So, as we continue to explore the life and times of Johann Sebastian Bach, it's time to address the elephant in the concert hall. How did the composer of intricate, mind-bending fugues become the poster child for tranquility and sleep? Buckle up, because this journey involves a mix of technological wizardry, determined musicologists, and a touch of irony that would make even Bach chuckle in his grave. Let's rewind to a time post-Mendelssohn's revival, when Bach's music, once again in vogue, began its ascent into the classical stratosphere. Yet, fast forward a bit more, and you'll find Bach's compositions slipping into an unexpected role, the ultimate bedtime companion. The transformation from Baroque complexity to soothing serenity didn't happen overnight. No, it was a gradual evolution, much like the shift from candlelight to electricity, with each step marked by innovation and a bit of serendipity. Now, let's talk numbers. The real game-changer in Bach's posthumous career came in the 20th century, with the advent of recording technology. Suddenly, those dense fugues and elaborate cantatas were no longer confined to dusty libraries or the occasional concert performance. In the 1920s and 30s, the technology to record and distribute music exploded, and Bach's works were among the first to benefit from this audio revolution. By the time the 1950s rolled around, vinyl records brought Bach into living rooms around the globe, allowing anyone with a turntable to experience his genius with the flick of a needle. But here's the kicker. Bach's journey from concert hall to the bedroom wasn't just a matter of technology. It was also about timing and cultural shifts. The mid-20th century saw a growing interest in meditation, relaxation, and the quest for inner peace, a counterbalance to the frenetic pace of modern life. Enter Bach, whose music, with its balanced structure and harmonic richness, provided the perfect soundtrack for this new age of calm. His compositions, originally designed to challenge and engage, now found a new purpose: relaxation. And what about those musicologists, you ask? Well, a handful of them, driven by passion and perhaps a touch of obsession, played a pivotal role in reshaping Bach's legacy. Figures like Albert Schweitzer and Wanda Landowska were instrumental in bringing Bach's music to wider audiences. Schweitzer, a polymath who was as comfortable with a scalpel as he was with a harpsichord, championed Bach's music through performances and writings. Landowska, a harpsichordist with a flair for the dramatic, revived the instrument itself as a vehicle for Bach's compositions, ensuring that his music was heard in its original Baroque splendor. It's worth noting the delicious irony here. A man who composed some of the most intellectually demanding music ever written is now synonymous with relaxation playlists. Imagine Bach in today's world. His music featured on apps promising better sleep in just 10 minutes. Would he have rolled his eyes or relished the thought of his melodies lulling people into dreamland? Hard to say, but one thing's for sure. Bach's music has a timeless quality that transcends its original intent. Even as we embrace the romantic notion of Bach as a soothing presence, let's not forget the realities of his life. This was a man who dealt with financial struggles, personal loss, and the relentless demands of his profession. He didn't compose with the intention of helping insomniacs or yoga enthusiasts. He wrote because he had to, because music was as essential to him as breathing. His compositions were a product of his time, his intellect, and his soul. Yet here we are, centuries later, finding solace in his work. And there's something beautifully human about this. It speaks to the universality of music and its ability to adapt and resonate with each new generation. Bach's legacy, therefore, isn't just about the notes on a page or the performances in a concert hall. It's about the enduring connection his music fosters between past and present, between the composer and the listener. In the end, Bach's story is a testament to the unpredictable nature of legacy. He may not have been celebrated in his lifetime the way he is today, but his music has achieved a kind of immortality that transcends accolades and fame. It's a reminder that true genius isn't always recognized immediately, but with time, it finds its place, weaving itself into the fabric of human experience. So as you drift off to sleep with Bach's melodies accompanying you, remember the journey that brought those notes from a Baroque church in Leipzig to your bedside. It's a journey marked by innovation, persistence, and a little bit of luck, qualities that Bach himself embodied. And as you close your eyes, let the music remind you of the power of creativity and the enduring impact of a life lived for art. Because in the end, that's what Bach's legacy is all about. A celebration of the human spirit, captured in sound, echoing through the ages. And with that, we wrap up our deep dive into the life and legacy of Johann Sebastian Bach, a composer who continues to inspire, challenge, and soothe us, one note at a time. Whether you're a devoted fan or a casual listener, Bach's music invites us all to explore the depths of emotion and the heights of intellectual achievement, an invitation that's as irresistible today as it was in his own time. So keep listening, keep exploring, and let Bach's music be the soundtrack to your own journey, wherever it may lead. In the heart of medieval France, where mud was as common as bread and kings were more likely to be found on a battlefield than in a palace, a young girl named Joan was getting some pretty peculiar career advice. You see, Joan of Arc, or Jeanne d'Arc, if we're doing this with a proper French accent, was born in 1412 in a little village called Domremy. Now, Domremy wasn't exactly the Paris of its day. It was more like the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's sheep by name. This was Lorraine, a region perpetually caught in the crossfire of the 100 Years' War, a conflict so long that people probably lost count somewhere around year 72. Joan, the daughter of Jacques d'Arc and Isabelle Remey, was one of 5 siblings. Her family was what you'd call peasant stock, a term that basically means they were the medieval version of today's middle class, minus the Wi-Fi and 2-car garage. But even in this humble setting, Joan had something that set her apart, visions. And not just any visions, but ones that featured saints like Michael, Catherine, and Margaret. Talk about a VIP guest list. These celestial advisors apparently suggested she do something about those pesky English and their French collaborators, the Burgundians, who were making a mess of France. Now, before you roll your eyes at the thought of a teenage girl leading armies because some saints told her to, remember that this was a time when people thought bathing was optional, and witch trials were the medieval equivalent of reality TV. But Joan wasn't just any teenager. By the tender age of 16, she was ready to leave her sheep-herding days behind and head off to save France, because why not? The early 15th century was not a great time to be French, economically speaking. The 100 Years' War had drained resources and left the countryside in shambles. Inflation was rampant, and the English occupied significant parts of the country. If you think today's political climate is rough, imagine a scenario where your leader has to flee because someone with a stronger claim to your throne is waiting with an army. Charles Roman VII, the Dauphin of France, was in just such a predicament. His legitimacy was questioned, his court was broke, and his enemies were knocking at the door. Enter Joan, stage right, with her divine mission and an accent that screamed, "I'm from Lorraine, deal with it." It's important to understand that Joan's rise as a military leader was not just improbable. It was downright absurd by the standards of the day. Women leading armies were about as common as unicorns, and yet here was Joan, a peasant girl, demanding an audience with royalty. When she finally got through to Charles in 1429, she didn't just convince him with her words. No, she went full medieval PR campaign, promising him a coronation in rhymes and victories over the English. The fact that she was right about these things is part of what makes her story legendary. But at the time, it was as believable as a fish walking a tightrope. Joan's visions have attracted a fair share of skepticism over the centuries. Some historians suggest she might have suffered from epilepsy or some other neurological condition. While others propose she was simply a savvy young woman using the tools available to her. After all, claiming divine guidance was a time-tested method of asserting authority in the Middle Ages. It's like using a celebrity endorsement today, except your celebrity is a saint, and the product is your leadership of the French army. However, the people of 15th century France were living in a world where the line between the divine and the mundane was blurrier than a drunkard's vision after a night at the tavern. Supernatural explanations were not just accepted, they were expected. So when Joan showed up at Charles's court, her claims were compelling enough to earn her armor and a banner. Whether you see this as a triumph of faith or a masterclass in medieval marketing, there's no denying that Joan had an uncanny ability to inspire those around her. As Joan prepared to lead her countrymen into battle, she faced immense skepticism, not just from the English, but from the French themselves. She had to prove that she was more than just a zealous teenager with a penchant for hearing voices. The Dauphin's advisors must have had some serious discussions, probably over the medieval equivalent of a strong coffee, about whether to trust this girl from nowhere with something as important as the fate of France. Yet, trust her they did, and she soon found herself at the head of an army, dressed in men's clothing, a practical choice for someone about to storm a city, but one that would later be used against her in the most tragic way. In the context of the 100 Years' War, Joan's presence was a game-changer. Imagine being an English soldier faced with the news that not only were the French rallying, but they were being led by a teenage girl claiming to have God on her side. It's the kind of plot twist that would make even a Shakespearean drama seem tame. Joan's story was one of grit, faith, and a fair bit of audacity, but it was also deeply rooted in the socio-political chaos of her time. France was in desperate need of a win, both on the battlefield and in the hearts of its people, and Joan seemed poised to deliver just that. As we set the stage for Joan's role in the 100 Years' War, it's essential to recognize the blend of myth and reality that defines her legacy. Joan of Arc, the peasant girl from Domremy, transformed into a warrior through a combination of divine inspiration, political savvy, and a hefty dose of courage. Whether we view her as a saint, a soldier, or a savvy strategist, her impact on France was undeniable. Her story is a testament to the power of belief and the unexpected ways in which history can unfold. So, as we continue to unravel the tale of Joan, let's remember that history is not just about dates and battles. It's about people, their dreams, and the improbable ways they sometimes come true. Joan's story was just getting warmed up. She prepared to take on the English at Orleans, a city that was more than just a dart on a medieval map. Orleans was the key to the Loire Valley, a strategic jackpot for whoever held it. Picture it like the VIP section at a concert. Everyone wanted in, but only one side could claim the spot. For the English, capturing Orleans would have been a massive power move, a checkmate in the grand game of chess that was the 100 Years' War. For the French, losing it would have been like dropping your phone in a river. Catastrophic. Now, the French army Joan was about to lead was more of a motley crew than a well-oiled machine. Think of it as the medieval version of the Bad News Bears. Many soldiers had been fighting for years, and morale was about as high as a worm's belly. Supplies were low, pay was inconsistent, and they were facing an enemy who had been winning for the better part of a century. Enter Joan, the teenage shepherdess with a divine mission and a knack for rallying the troops. She was a living, breathing pep talk, and the French needed all the pep they could get. Joan's leadership style wasn't what you'd call by the book, assuming there was a book about teenage girls leading armies. She was a mix of saintly inspiration and practical determination. She ordered the soldiers to clean up their act, literally. No more swearing, no more looting, and definitely no more visiting the local brothels. If you're imagining a bunch of grizzled knights rolling their eyes, you wouldn't be far off. But here's the kicker, they listened. Joan had the kind of conviction that made even the most skeptical soldier take a step back and reconsider his life choices. As for medieval warfare logistics, let's just say it was less five-star catering and more survival of the fittest. Troops often lived off whatever they could scrounge or steal, and rations were, well, bleak. Bread, cheese, and salted meat were staples, but calling them meals might be generous. Picture gnawing on a piece of shoe leather, and you're halfway there. The French soldiers' diet would make a modern MRE look like a Michelin-starred meal. Joan's presence, however, seemed to make even the most meager fare feel like a feast, at least in spirit. Her faith was infectious, and it translated into a renewed sense of purpose for her ragtag army. Joan's arrival at Orleans in April 1429 was like a shot of adrenaline to the French cause. The city had been under siege for months, and the situation was looking grim. The English had constructed a series of fortifications, and their control of the river restricted the flow of supplies into the city. It was a stranglehold, and the French needed a miracle. Joan, with her banner and her unwavering belief, was just that, a miracle in armor. She wasn't about to let the English continue their stranglehold without a fight. So, how did Joan plan to break the siege? With a combination of bold attacks and psychological warfare. She sent letters to the English demanding they leave. Polite, right. But when that didn't work, she took a more direct approach. Joan led several assaults on the English fortifications, bringing a sense of urgency and boldness that had been sorely lacking. Her strategy was simple but effective. Hit them hard, hit them fast, and keep them guessing. Joan's presence on the battlefield was like a bolt of lightning, striking fear into the hearts of her enemies and invigorating her allies. Joan's leadership during the siege was a game-changer. Despite the odds, she inspired the defenders of Orleans to push back against the English forces. The turning point came in early May, when Joan led a series of daring attacks on the English-held bastions. These weren't just tactical victories. They were morale boosters, each one a step closer to breaking the siege. The French army, once a collection of disheartened soldiers, was now a force to be reckoned with, driven by a shared belief in Joan's divine mission. The siege of Orleans was lifted on May 8, 1429, a date that would go down in history as a turning point in the 100 Years' War. Joan's leadership had not only saved the city, but also rejuvenated the French cause. Her success was a reminder that, sometimes, the most improbable leaders can inspire the greatest victories. As for the English, they were left to lick their wounds and wonder how a teenage girl had managed to outsmart them on the battlefield. In the aftermath of Orleans, Joan's legend only grew. Her victory was hailed as a sign of divine favor, and her reputation as a warrior saint was cemented. Joan had proven that courage, conviction, and a little divine intervention could change the course of history. Her journey was far from over, but the siege of Orleans had set the stage for her next great adventure, a march to Rheims for the coronation of Charles Roman VII. As we leave Joan and her army celebrating their hard-won victory, let's remember that history isn't just about the battles fought and the victories won. It's about the people who dared to defy the odds and reshape the world in their image. Joan of Arc was one such person, a beacon of hope in a time of darkness. Her story is a testament to the power of belief and the indomitable spirit of those who refuse to accept defeat. And as we move forward, there's plenty more to explore in the remarkable tale of the Maid of Orleans. Stay tuned. Joan's journey is just getting started. As the celebratory echoes of Orleans began to fade, Joan wasn't about to rest on her laurels, or her armor for that matter. The next chapter in her audacious campaign against the English was already unfolding, and it was heading straight for a little place called Paris. Now, if Orleans was the epic comeback concert, Paris was the surprise encore that left everyone, especially the English, scratching their heads and wondering what on earth just happened. Post-Orleans, the French forces were buoyant, and Joan's popularity was skyrocketing faster than a medieval tick-tock sensation. But let's not get carried away with the hero worship just yet. Joan's victories were as much about strategy as they were about spirit. She wasn't just charging in with a banner and a prayer. She was adapting to the battlefield, a place where communication usually meant shouting over the clash of swords and hoping your message didn't get lost in translation, or worse, in an untimely arrow. Enter the Battle of Paris on June 18, 1429. This was the medieval version of a surprise party, except the English were the ones being surprised, and they definitely weren't in the mood for cake. The French, led by Joan, and a couple of seasoned commanders like La Hire and Jean-Parton de Zaintrailles, caught the English with their metaphorical pants down, or in this case, without their protective stakes up. You see, the English longbowmen, those fearsome archers who could rain chaos from a distance, had a habit of planting wooden stakes in the ground for defense. But at Paris, their stakes were still packed away, like umbrellas left at home on a rainy day. Whoops. the French cavalry, not one to miss an opportunity, charged with all the subtlety of a bull in a china shop. The result? A grand English rout, with casualties numbering around 200, including the capture of the esteemed English commander, Sir John Talbot. It was a staggering reversal of fortune, akin to watching a team that's been in last place all season suddenly win the championship. The French losses were minimal, a mere handful compared to their foes. It wasn't just a victory, it was a statement. Joan's influence on French tactics was becoming apparent. Her presence was like caffeine to the French troops, energizing, clarifying, and a bit jittery at times. She advocated for aggression, capitalizing on the English disarray and turning what could have been a standoff into a rout. Her strategy was simple. Keep moving, keep striking, and don't give the enemy time to regroup. It's the kind of advice you'd expect from a coach, not a chef de stern saint. But let's take a moment to appreciate the less glamorous side of medieval knighthood. For every shining suit of armor, there was a knight inside sweating buckets, hoping his squire hadn't forgotten to sharpen his sword. And while the legends paint them as noble and dashing, the reality was more mud-soaked and lice-ridden. Communication on the battlefield, more like a game of medieval telephone, where vital commands often ended up garbled or hilariously misinterpreted. It's a wonder any battles were won at all, given the chaos. Economically, the victory at Patay was a windfall for the French. Securing a win meant more than just bragging rights. It was a morale booster that translated into tangible resources. The countryside, wary of English dominance, began to rally to Charles Roman VII cause, filling French coffers with taxes and tribute. Joan's victories were like a medieval stimulus package, breathing life into a war-weary nation. As for Joan, her legend was growing with every battle. She wasn't just a military leader. She was becoming a symbol of national resurgence, a beacon of hope in a time when France was in desperate need of both. Her victories were seen as divinely ordained, a narrative that was both powerful and politically advantageous for Charles Roman VII. It's one thing to rally troops with promises of glory. It's another to suggest that God himself is on your side. Talk about a motivational speech. In the grand tapestry of the 100 Years' War, Patay was a decisive thread that began to unravel English control in northern France. Joan's influence was undeniable, not just in the tactics on the battlefield, but in the hearts of the soldiers she led. Her success was a testament to the power of belief and the surprising ways in which leadership can manifest. Joan's story was far from over, and with each victory, the stakes, both literal and figurative, were only getting higher. As we leave the triumphant fields of Patay, remember that Joan's journey wasn't just about battles and victories. It was about reshaping the narrative of a nation, one skirmish at a time. Her story is a reminder that sometimes the most unlikely heroes make the greatest impact. Stay tuned, because the road to Rheims and the coronation of Charles Roman VII is just around the corner, and Joan's tale is still unfolding with all the drama, intrigue, and unexpected twists of a medieval epic. And so, the road to Rheims lay open, paved with the victories of Orleans and Patay, victories that had transformed Joan from a mere footnote in history into a living legend. But while her story reads like an epic, it was soon to take a sharp detour into the realm of political intrigue and betrayal. You see, 100 Years' War wasn't just about swords clashing and castles burning. It was also a colossal chess match, with Joan as an unexpected piece on the board, one that would soon be captured. Fast forward to the spring of 1430, and our heroine finds herself in the thick of another campaign, this time aimed at liberating Compiègne from Burgundian forces. Now, the Burgundians were the frenemy alliance France wished it didn't have. Technically, they were French, but they'd cozied up to the English like a cat to a warm lap, making them less reliable than an umbrella in a hurricane. Joan's mission was simple: break the siege, save the city, and keep the momentum going. But this time, fortune wasn't on her side. On May 23, 1430, during a skirmish outside the city walls, Joan was unceremoniously unhorsed and captured by the Burgundians. For a woman who'd faced down armies and endured the chaos of battle, being taken prisoner must have felt like being benched at the Super Bowl. But this was no ordinary capture. No, it was a golden opportunity for the Burgundians, and they were not about to squander it. Joan's capture was less about military strategy and more about cold, hard cash. The Burgundians were keenly aware of the bounty on her head, and let's be honest, Money talks, especially in the Middle Ages, when a noble ransom could fund a small war or, at the very least, a lavish party. The price tag on Joan, a whopping 10,000 livres tournois, roughly the GDP of a small medieval kingdom, or at least a very well-stocked wine cellar. Enter the English, who were all too eager to foot the bill. For them, Joan was a thorn in their side, a symbol of French resurgence that needed quashing. By purchasing Joan, the English aimed to kill two birds with one stone, discredit the French crown, and rid themselves of a pesky military nemesis. It was a strategic masterstroke, like nabbing the queen in chess, while your opponent is busy admiring their knights. Now, Joan's transition from battlefield heroine to political pawn was as swift as it was brutal. Her capture set the stage for one of the most infamous trials in history, a trial that was less about justice and more about public relations. The English want to portray Joan not as a divinely inspired savior, but as a heretic and a fraud. Talk about a character assassination worthy of a tabloid headline. So, to Rouen she went, where the trial was to be held. Picture it, a dimly lit hall, filled with ecclesiastical bigwigs and legal minds, all eager to prove that Joan was a witch, a heretic, and wait for it, a cross-dresser. Yes, in what can only be described as the medieval equivalent of a dress code violation, Joan's penchant for wearing men's clothing was a major point of contention. In an era when gender roles were as rigid as the armor knights wore, this was scandalous. Forget treason or witchcraft. In the eyes of her judges, wearing pants was apparently the 8th deadly sin. The charges against Joan were as varied as they were absurd. They accused her of everything from witchcraft to blasphemy, all wrapped up in a neat package of misogyny and political expediency. The trial, which began on January 9, 1431, was a circus without the clowns, though some might argue that the judges filled that role quite nicely. It was as much about silencing a symbol as it was about satisfying the theological curiosities of the day. Joan's defense was as simple as it was poignant. She was guided by her visions, visions that had led her to victory and ultimately to trial. She stood firm in her beliefs, even when faced with the intimidating glare of her inquisitors. Her refusal to recant, to deny her experiences, was a testament to her unyielding spirit. The English, however, were determined to break her, to force a confession that would serve their agenda. Meanwhile, in the world outside, life went on. The 100 Years' War continued, with battles and sieges unfolding like chapters in a never-ending book. The French, buoyed by Joan's earlier successes, were regrouping, while the English were licking their wounds, trying to maintain their grip on French territories. The political landscape was a tangled mess of alliances and betrayals, with Joan's trial adding fuel to the fire. Economically, the stakes were high. The war had drained resources on both sides, and the burden of taxation weighed heavily on the peasantry, who, let's face it, were more concerned with surviving the next winter than with the political machinations of their rulers. Joan's trial, while significant, was just one thread in the tapestry of a conflict that was as much about economic power as it was about national identity. Back in the courtroom, the trial dragged on, a grim spectacle of legal theatrics. Joan, isolated and defiant, became a pawn in a game she couldn't win. Her fate was sealed not by the evidence, but by the political winds. On May 30, 1431, Joan was found guilty and sentenced to death by burning, a fate reserved for those deemed heretics and witches. It was a gruesome end for a woman whose only crime was believing she could change the world. As Joan faced the flames, her legacy began to take root. Her death, intended to extinguish her influence, only served to cement her status as a martyr. The English had sought to discredit her, but in doing so, they unwittingly elevated her to a symbol of French resilience and faith. Her story transcended the battlefield, becoming a rallying cry for those who believed in the power of conviction and the possibility of miracles. But let's not get too misty-eyed just yet. Joan's execution was a stark reminder of the brutal realities of medieval politics, where power was wielded with a ruthless efficiency that makes modern scandals look like playground squabbles. Her trial was a farce, a tragic comedy of errors that highlighted the absurdities of an age where belief was both weapon and shield. Joan's capture and trial were pivotal chapters in the saga of the 100 Years' War, a conflict that was as much about personal vendettas as it was about national destiny. Her journey from peasant to saint, from leader to martyr, was a testament to the unpredictable nature of history, where the line between hero and villain is often drawn in the sands of time. As we close this chapter, let's remember that Joan's story doesn't end here. Her legacy lived on, inspiring generations, and eventually leading to her canonization in 1920. She became a symbol not just of French nationalism, but of the enduring power of faith and courage in the face of overwhelming odds. Joan of Arc may have been burned at the stake, but her flame continues to burn bright, a beacon for those who dare to dream the impossible. Stay tuned, because the final act of this epic tale is still to come. Joan of Arc's story may have ended in flames, but the aftermath was anything but a smouldering pile of ashes. Her execution in 1431 was a turning point, not just for France, but for the entire narrative of the 100 Years' War. You see, martyrdom has a funny way of backfiring on one's enemies. The English might have expected her death to demoralize the French, but instead it lit a fire, metaphorically speaking, that burned brighter than ever. Let's start with the immediate aftermath. France, still reeling from decades of war, saw Joan as a symbol of hope and resistance. Her execution, intended to extinguish her influence, only served to cement her status as a martyr. The French propaganda machine kicked into high gear, painting Joan as a saintly figure who had been wronged by the cruel English. It was a PR campaign that could put modern spin doctors to shame. Charles Roman VII, the once doubtful Dauphin, now had a martyr to rally his troops around, and rally they did. Over the next 2 decades, French forces slowly but surely pushed the English back, reclaiming territory and eventually bringing the war to a close with the Treaty of Picquigny in 1475. But Joan's influence wasn't just a short-term boost for the French war effort. Her trial and execution highlighted the deep fractures within the Catholic Church and political structures of the time. The ecclesiastical court that condemned her was seen as a puppet of English interests, which didn't sit well with many. Fast forward to 1456, and we find a new trial, a retrial to be exact, sometimes called the nullification trial. This time, Joan's reputation got a posthumous makeover. In a classic case of too little, too late, the court declared her innocent of all charges. The verdict: she was not a witch, but rather a victim of a politically motivated trial. It was history's way of saying, oops, our bad. Now, let's talk economics. The 100 Years' War had left France in tatters, with fields that resembled lunar landscapes after years of scorched earth tactics. Agriculture was disrupted, trade routes were compromised, and entire towns had been razed to the ground. But Joan's legacy helped spark a resurgence. With renewed nationalism, the French crown managed to centralize power and stabilize the economy. Charles Roman VII implemented reforms, including a standing army and improved taxation systems, which laid the groundwork for a more prosperous France. Think of it as a medieval version of pulling oneself up by the bootstraps, if those bootstraps were made of feudal levies and tax collectors. Politically, Joan's influence was equally profound. Her story underscored the power of individual agency in an era dominated by kings and nobles. Here was a peasant girl who changed the course of history, a narrative that inspired generations to come. Her life became a rallying cry for those who believed in the potential of the common folk, setting the stage for later movements that challenged the status quo. It's no coincidence that Joan became a symbol of the French Revolution centuries later, her image emblazoned on banners as revolutionaries stormed the Bastille. But let's not gloss over the mythologizing that happened along the way. Joan's story was ripe for romantic retelling, and over the centuries she morphed into a figure of legend. The gritty details of medieval warfare, the mud and blood of battle, were replaced with shiny armor and saintly halos. The reality: leading an army was less about shining in the sun and more about wading through muck, both literal and metaphorical. Her visions were romanticized, turned into divine proclamations rather than the complex psychological experiences they may have been. Sure, the story of a saintly maiden leading her people to victory is more palatable than a tale of political intrigue and betrayal, but it's the latter that truly captures the essence of her time. Modern interpretations often skip these nuances, focusing instead on the spectacle of Joan in full battle regalia, banner held high. While it's tempting to see her as the knight in shining armor, the truth is more complicated. Joan's life was marked by struggle, both internal and external. Her story is a testament to the human spirit, yes, but also a cautionary tale about the perils of power and politics. In a world where alliances shifted as quickly as the wind, Joan's unwavering conviction was both her greatest strength and her ultimate downfall. Joan of Arc's legacy is a tapestry woven with threads of myth and reality, a blend of fact and fiction that captivates to this day. She has been adopted as a symbol by countless movements, from nationalism to feminism, each seeing in her story a reflection of their own struggles. Her canonization in 1920 by Pope Benedict XV was the final acknowledgement of her enduring impact, turning the once condemned heretic into a saint recognized by the church that had once reviled her. In the end, Joan's story is a reminder that history is as much about the stories we choose to tell as it is about the events themselves. Her life challenges us to look beyond the surface, to question the narratives that have been handed down, and to seek the truth amid the legends. So the next time you hear her tale, remember the grit behind the glory, the reality behind the romance. Joan of Arc may have been a saint, but she was also a human, flawed and complex, a figure whose legacy continues to inspire and provoke, even as it evolves with the times. And that, dear listener, is the real magic of history, its ability to grow and change with us, always offering new insights into the human condition. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who would go on to reshuffle the map of Europe like a bored kid with a jigsaw puzzle, started off life in a rather unexpected place, Corsica. Now, if you've ever been to Corsica, you know it's a delightful island with dramatic cliffs and a Mediterranean vibe that screams relaxation more than world conquest. But for Napoleon, born there on August 15, 1769, it was the beginning of a journey that would take him far beyond those sunny shores. Corsica had only been a part of France for a year when Napoleon popped into the world, making him technically French, but culturally he was more Corsican through and through. The Bonaparte family, originally of minor Italian nobility, were newcomers in this French domain, and young Napoleon was keenly aware of his outsider status. You could say this awareness sparked a little chip on his shoulder, one that would grow into a mountain as he climbed the ranks of military and political power. From a young age, Napoleon was a scrappy kid with a penchant for mischief and a brain like a sponge for military strategy. His father, Carlo Bonaparte, was ambitious enough to secure Napoleon a spot at the military school in Brienne-le-Chateau at the tender age of 9. Picture a pint-sized Napoleon, not yet 5 feet tall, surrounded by French aristocratic brats with powdered wigs and fancy accents. Safe to say, he stuck out like a sore thumb, but instead of sulking, he channeled that outsider energy into proving himself, spending more time with maps and cannons than making friends. Brienne was where Napoleon's sharp mind and sharper tongue started to shine. Despite being marked for his Corsican accent and short stature, he devoured the works of classical military strategists like Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. His teachers noted his brilliance, if not his social graces. One school report even labeled him as domineering and inclined to be quarrelsome, which is teacher speak, for this kid's got some serious leadership potential, but could use a chill pill. After Brienne, Napoleon moved on to the École Militaire in Paris, the prestigious institution where he completed his education in just 1 year instead of the standard 2. Talk about overachieving. He graduated as a second lieutenant of artillery, a career path that fit him like a glove. Napoleon understood the power of artillery better than most, seeing it not just as a tool for destruction, but as the key to dominating the battlefield. Now, you might assume that young Napoleon's life was a series of military triumphs from here on out, but reality has this annoying habit of deflating legends. At around 16, Napoleon found himself back in Corsica during the French Revolution, a time when things were more chaotic than a toddler on a sugar high. He initially supported Corsican independence, led by the fiery Pasquale Paoli. But when Paoli turned against France, Napoleon's loyalties flipped faster than a pancake on a hot griddle. This little episode got the Bonaparte family booted from the island, and they had to flee to mainland France, which in hindsight was the best eviction notice Napoleon ever got. The revolution was both a curse and a blessing for Napoleon. The social upheaval allowed him to rise through the ranks faster than a cat on a hot tin roof. He got his first taste of real command at the siege of Toulon in 1793. At just 24 years old, Napoleon turned what could have been a disastrous situation for the French into a remarkable victory. He implemented a plan that involved capturing strategic hills and using artillery to pound the British fleet, forcing them into a hasty retreat. It was here he earned his promotion to Brigadier General, a title he wore with all the pride you'd expect from a kid who once got picked last for dodgeball. Napoleon's knack for strategy wasn't just about knowing where to place the cannons. He had this uncanny ability to read the battlefield like a chessboard, staying 3 moves ahead of his opponents. It's like he had a military version of X-ray vision, seeing vulnerabilities and opportunities that others missed. But it wasn't all sunshine and victories. His ambition often led him into risky ventures, pushing boundaries that could have easily backfired. Lucky for him, they rarely did. Of course, Napoleon's rise wasn't just due to his strategic brilliance. France at the time was a nation in turmoil, with opportunities for advancement popping up like weeds. The revolution had torn down the old order, and Napoleon's timing was impeccable. He was the right man in the right place at the right time, equipped with the right talents. His Corsican roots, once a source of ridicule, became an asset, giving him a unique perspective on the value of self-determination and the power of a unified state. But let's not get too romantic about it. Underneath the stories of heroism and genius was a very human Napoleon, prone to fits of rage and vanity. He was known to throw epic tantrums, and his ego could fill a room faster than his troops could march across a battlefield. Yet, these human flaws only serve to make his story more compelling. They remind us that even the greatest figures in history have their quirks and shortcomings, making them relatable in their own peculiar ways. By the time the dust settled on his early years, Napoleon had forged a reputation as a formidable leader, a thinker who could outmaneuver his opponents both politically and militarily. His journey from a Corsican outcast to the darling of the French military was nothing short of meteoric. Little did he know that this was just the opening act of a saga that would see him crowned as Emperor of the French, only to eventually face his own dramatic downfall. But for now, in these early chapters, Napoleon was a rising star. A young, ambitious Corsican with a vision as vast as the empire he would one day command. As Napoleon basked in the glow of his newfound fame, the French Revolution continued its chaotic dance, tossing crowns and titles around like confetti at a particularly rowdy party. Opportunities for advancement were ripe for the picking, and Napoleon had a knack for plucking them with the precision of a master chess player. His next big gig, commanding the French army in Italy, a role he took on in 1796 at the ripe old age of 26. If you thought he needed more seasoning, well, the man was about to prove everyone wrong in spectacular fashion. Now, the Italian campaign wasn't just about flexing military muscle. It was also about economics, as most wars tend to be. France was broke, like rummage through the couch cushions for spare francs broke. The Directory, France's ruling body at the time, was desperate for a financial lifeline. Italy, with its wealth and strategic positioning, seemed like a tantalizing target. Enter Napoleon, with a ragtag army short on supplies and morale, but long on ambition and ingenuity. Napoleon's strategy in Italy was nothing short of revolutionary. Instead of the ponderous, direct confrontations that characterized the military tactics of yore, he opted for speed and surprise. He moved his troops with the kind of agility that would make a ballet dancer jealous, striking where his enemies least expected. His forces marched over 80 miles in less than 48 hours to outmaneuver the Piedmontese and Austrians, a feat that left his adversaries scrambling to keep up. In the Battle of Montenard, he demonstrated his flair for the dramatic. Using the element of surprise, he attacked the Austrians, forcing them into a retreat. The aftermath was a domino effect of victories. Dago, Mondovi, and Lodi followed in quick succession. At Lodi, Napoleon earned his soldiers undying loyalty, leading a daring charge across a bridge under heavy fire, a scene so cinematic it could have been plucked straight out of a Hollywood blockbuster. His men affectionately nicknamed him the Little Corporal, a nod to his willingness to be in the thick of the action. While the victories were piling up, so were the spoils. Napoleon's requisitioning of resources from conquered territories helped fill the coffers back in France. He sent back countless art pieces, a cultural haul that would later enrich the Louvre and remind everyone that war, for all its horrors, is sometimes about who gets to keep the prettiest pictures. But it wasn't just about art and gold. Napoleon's victories in Italy also secured crucial political leverage, forcing Austria to sign the Treaty of Campo Formio in 1797, which effectively redrew the map of Europe. It was a masterstroke of diplomacy and military might, showcasing Napoleon's ability to wield the pen as effectively as the sword. Having tasted success in Italy, Napoleon turned his gaze towards Egypt in 1798, a land teeming with ancient mysteries, and more importantly for him, strategic value, the goal: disrupt British trade routes to India and establish a French presence in the East. It was an audacious plan, and one that required not just military prowess, but also a bit of marketing flair. So, Napoleon donned the hat of a scholar, bringing along a team of scientists and scholars to enlighten Egypt while simultaneously planning to conquer it. His arrival in Alexandria was less about diplomacy and more about shock and awe, as his forces swiftly took the city. But Egypt proved to be a tougher nut to crack than Italy. The Battle of the Pyramids in July 1798 was a triumph, showcasing Napoleon's use of the divisional square, a formation that turned his soldiers into an impregnable fortress against the Mamluk cavalry. Yet, the victory was bittersweet. Just weeks later, the British, under Admiral Horatio Nelson, delivered a crushing blow at the Battle of the Nile, sinking most of the French fleet and leaving Napoleon's army stranded in Egypt like a vacationer who missed the last ferry home. Undaunted, Napoleon decided to turn his geographical isolation into a public relations coup. He dove headfirst into Egyptian culture, presenting himself as a liberator rather than a conqueror. He even played the part of an archaeologist, commissioning studies of the Great Pyramids and the Sphinx, which, while a bit of a distraction, did result in the Rosetta Stone's discovery, a linguistic breakthrough that would later unlock the secrets of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. Yet, the logistics of maintaining an army in Egypt were about as pleasant as a sunburn on a July afternoon. Supplies dwindled, morale sagged, and disease ran rampant. To add insult to injury, a costly campaign into Syria in 1799, including a failed siege of Acre, underscored the limits of Napoleon's ambitions. In a surprising twist, Napoleon decided he'd had enough of playing Lawrence of Arabia, and in August 1799 made the breathtakingly bold move of abandoning his army in Egypt to return to France. It was a classic Napoleon maneuver. When the chips were down, he folded the hand and walked away with his own skin intact. The French army, however, was left to deal with the consequences, eventually surrendering in 1801. Back in France, Napoleon's knack for turning lemons into lemonade was on full display. He spun his Egyptian escapade into a tale of adventure and scientific triumph, conveniently glossing over the less glamorous details of defeat and abandonment. His return was greeted with adulation, and in a move that would put modern political strategists to shame, he leveraged his newfound popularity to orchestrate a coup in November 1799, establishing himself as first consul of France. Napoleon's rise was meteoric, fueled by a mix of strategic genius, relentless ambition, and a flair for the dramatic. His campaigns in Italy and Egypt were not just military maneuvers, but exercises in logistics, propaganda, and political calculation. Through it all, Napoleon demonstrated a remarkable ability to adapt, improvise, and above all, survive. Yet for all his triumphs, his story was far from over. The stage was set for his greatest acts, and most humbling defeats still to come. But that's a tale for another time, as the saga of Napoleon Bonaparte continues to unfold with all the twists and turns of a well-crafted thriller. And so, Napoleon returned to France, dusted off the sand from his Egyptian exploits, and settled into his latest role like a cat, finding the sunniest spot on the couch. With the coup of 1799 under his belt, the stage was set for Napoleon's most audacious play yet, turning the French Republic into his personal empire. Now, if you're thinking this sounds like the plot of an epic drama, you're not wrong. It was a saga of ambition, power, and a bit of luck, like a real-life Game of Thrones, minus the dragons. Napoleon's ascent to emperor in 1804 was as much about optics as it was about politics. Picture this. A man who once fought for republican ideals now crowning himself in the Notre Dame Cathedral, a move that screamed, "I'm the boss now," with the subtlety of a brass band. It was a political masterstroke, designed to cement his power while also nodding to the divine right of kings. Because why not have your cake and eat it too? But let's not get sidetracked by the shiny crown. Napoleon's real genius lay in his battlefield brilliance, a talent that reached its zenith at the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805. This was his piece de résistance, a military symphony conducted with the precision of a maestro. Facing the combined forces of Russia and Austria, Napoleon was outnumbered, 73,000 French troops against 85,000 of the enemy. But where others saw an insurmountable challenge, Napoleon saw opportunity. The battle unfolded on December 2, 1805, with a strategic feint that would go down in military textbooks. Napoleon deliberately weakened his right flank, baiting the Allies into thinking they'd found a soft spot. Like a cat toying with a mouse, he waited until they took the bait, then unleashed his own trap. The French forces, hidden in the morning fog like ninjas in a bad 80s movie, struck with a ferocity that shattered the Allied center. Within hours, Napoleon achieved what he called his finest hour, decimating the opposing forces and capturing over 10,000 prisoners. Austerlitz wasn't just a victory. It was a spectacle that underscored Napoleon's strategic genius. It was like watching a chess grandmaster win a game in 3 moves, leaving his opponents scratching their heads and wondering what just happened. But for all the poetry in his tactics, let's not forget the prose of war. 36,000 casualties, a stark reminder that brilliance often comes at a brutal cost. With Austerlitz, Napoleon's reputation as an invincible military leader was cemented, or so it seemed. The reality, however, was more complex. Sure, Napoleon had a knack for winning battles, but his victories often sowed the seeds of future conflicts. After Austerlitz, the Third Coalition collapsed, but like a bad sequel, new coalitions arose, eager to take him down. Europe was now Napoleon's chessboard, and he was determined to play until there were no pieces left. Yet beyond the battlefield, Napoleon was also a shrewd economic strategist. He knew that controlling Europe wasn't just about military might. It was also about economic domination. Enter the continental system, Napoleon's grandiose attempt to choke Britain's economy by banning European trade with the island nation. The idea: starve Britain into submission by hitting them where it hurt most, their wallets. In theory, the continental system was brilliant. In practice, it was about as effective as using a colander to carry water. Smuggling flourished, European economies suffered, and the British, with their naval supremacy, found alternate trade routes. Napoleon's attempt to create a fortress Europe was crumbling faster than a house of cards in a hurricane, a fact he chose to ignore like a student avoiding eye contact with a teacher after failing a test. But where Napoleon's economic policies faltered, his political acumen shone. He reshaped European borders with the finesse of a sculptor, creating satellite states and placing his family members on thrones like pieces on a monopoly board. The Confederation of the Rhine, the Duchy of Warsaw, these weren't just territories. They were extensions of Napoleon's influence, each serving as a buffer against his many enemies. However, even the most skilled juggler drops a ball now and then. And for Napoleon, that ball was Russia. The 1812 Russian campaign was supposed to be a quick and decisive victory, but it turned into a catastrophic miscalculation. With a grand armée of over 600,000 men, Napoleon marched into Russia, expecting a swift conquest. Instead, he found a landscape as unforgiving as a Siberian winter. The Russians, under Tsar Alexander I, employed a scorched earth policy, retreating and burning everything in their wake. Napoleon's army, already stretched thin, faced supply shortages, harsh weather, and fierce resistance. By the time they reached Moscow in September, the city was deserted and ablaze, a smoldering testament to the futility of Napoleon's ambitions. The retreat from Moscow was a nightmare of epic proportions. Of the 600,000 troops who had marched in, fewer than 30,000 limped back. Starvation, disease, and relentless Russian attacks turned the Grande Armée into a ragged procession of survivors. Napoleon's aura of invincibility was shattered, leaving Europe to question whether the emperor had finally met his match. For all the romanticism of Napoleon's exploits, the Russian campaign was a stark reminder of the limits of ambition. It was a lesson in hubris, a tale of how even the mightiest can fall when they overreach. Yet for Napoleon, the fall was not the end. As Europe circled like vultures, eager to pick apart his empire, he prepared for one last stand, a testament to the indomitable spirit that had defined his rise. But as the story of Napoleon continues, we see the man behind the myth, a leader whose genius was matched only by his flaws, a strategist who could bend the rules of war, but not those of human nature. His empire, like all great empires, was built on a foundation of sand, destined to be washed away by the tides of history. Yet even as the tides turned, Napoleon's legacy endured, a legacy that, for better or worse, would shape the world long after his time. And so, Napoleon found himself at a crossroads, his empire's grand tapestry starting to unravel at the edges. After the spectacular debacle in Russia, you'd think Napoleon might have taken a step back to reassess. But no, our man was nothing if not audacious. Facing setbacks that would make most leaders reconsider their life choices, Napoleon instead decided to double down, a strategy that sounds as risky as investing your life savings in a magic bean. Enter the Peninsular War, a conflict that would reveal the limits of Napoleon's genius and the depths of his diplomatic blunders. It all kicked off in 1808 when Napoleon, in a move that was part strategic genius and part overconfident folly, decided to install his brother Joseph on the Spanish throne. Now, you might wonder why Napoleon thought this was a good idea. Perhaps he was playing a game of monarchs, family addition, but the Spanish people were not amused. They saw it less as a benevolent promotion and more as foreign meddling with a side of nepotism. The Spanish resistance, fueled by a mix of patriotism and a healthy dose of outrage, turned into a full-blown guerrilla war. And here's where things got sticky for Napoleon. While he could orchestrate grand battles with the precision of a maestro conducting an orchestra, guerrilla warfare was a different beast altogether. It was messy, unpredictable, and stubbornly resistant to his usual tactics. The Spanish fighters, with their hit-and-run tactics, turned the Iberian Peninsula into a quagmire that bogged down French forces like quicksand. To make matters worse, the British, ever eager to poke a finger in Napoleon's eye, decided to support the Spanish resistance. Enter Sir Arthur Wellesley, later known as the Duke of Wellington, a name that would soon become synonymous with Napoleon's headaches. Wellesley and his British troops landed in Portugal, kicking off a series of battles that would bleed Napoleon's forces dry over the next 6 years. The Peninsular War was less about sweeping victories and more about attrition. It was a slow grind, a series of small skirmishes and battles that sapped French resources and morale. Napoleon's forces were stretched thin, their supply lines constantly harassed by Spanish guerrillas. The war drained the French treasury too, costing an estimated 450 million francs by its end. For context, that's like burning through your lottery winnings to fuel a bonfire, a spectacular display, but ultimately futile. Yet, while the Peninsular War was a thorn in his side, Napoleon's attention was still divided. He had bigger fish to fry, or more accurately, a bigger bear to wrestle with. The Russian campaign had left his forces decimated, and Europe was beginning to smell blood in the water. The Sixth Coalition, an alliance of Britain, Russia, Prussia, and Austria, formed with one goal in mind: take down the French emperor once and for all. Napoleon, ever the optimist, wasn't about to go down without a fight. He raised a new army, a feat that speaks volumes about his charisma and the desperation of the French state. But this army was a shadow of the Grande Armée, young, inexperienced, and lacking the seasoned veterans who had once been his backbone. Think of it as replacing your A-team with a group of enthusiastic interns. Sure, they had potential, but they were hardly ready for prime time. By 1813, the stage was set for one of the most epic showdowns in history, the Battle of Leipzig, also known as the Battle of Nations. It was the largest battle in Europe prior to World War I, involving over 600,000 troops from all sides. For 3 days in October, the fields around Leipzig were a cacophony of cannon fire, cavalry charges, and the screams of men locked in mortal combat. Napoleon, outnumbered and outgunned, fought valiantly, but ultimately faced the harsh reality that even his genius couldn't overcome the sheer weight of numbers against him. Leipzig was a turning point, signaling the beginning of the end for Napoleon's empire. His allies deserted him faster than rats off a sinking ship, and by early 1814, the coalition forces were marching into France itself. Paris was captured in March, and in April, Napoleon was forced to abdicate. The once mighty emperor was sent packing to the island of Elba, a Mediterranean dart that would serve as his gilded cage. Now, if this were a fairy tale, it might end here, with Napoleon contemplating his life choices while watching the waves lap against Elba's shores. But history, much like Napoleon himself, tends to favor drama over tidy conclusions. While Europe breathed a sigh of relief, Napoleon was far from finished. The man who had once crowned himself in Notre Dame wasn't about to let a little thing like exile stop him. In March 1815, less than a year after his abdication, Napoleon made a daring escape from Elba, landing in France with a small band of followers. The newly restored Bourbon monarchy, led by Louis Roman XVIII, must have felt like they'd booked a horror movie marathon without realizing the protagonist was about to make a comeback. As Napoleon marched towards Paris, soldiers sent to arrest him instead joined his cause, drawn by the same charisma that had once captivated Europe. This period, known as the 100 Days, was a whirlwind of political maneuvering and military preparation. Napoleon's return was a masterclass in propaganda and personal magnetism, culminating in his triumphant re-entry into Paris. But Europe, having tasted victory, wasn't about to let Napoleon reclaim his empire without a fight. The Seventh Coalition formed, and the final act of this epic saga was set to unfold. And so, the stage was set for Waterloo, a battle that would become synonymous with ultimate defeat. But let's not jump the gun. For now, Napoleon was back in the game, a reminder that even when the odds are stacked against you, audacity has a way of rewriting the script. With his empire crumbling and enemies at every turn, Napoleon was ready to face his fate with the same flair and defiance that had defined his rise. But that's a tale for next time, as the echoes of Waterloo loom on the horizon, promising a dramatic conclusion to the story of Napoleon Bonaparte. In the end, Napoleon's tale is a testament to the complexities of ambition and the thin line between genius and folly. His decline wasn't a single dramatic fall, but a series of miscalculations and overreaches, each building upon the last, until even the mightiest empire couldn't withstand the strain. Yet, for all his flaws and failures, Napoleon remains a figure of enduring fascination, a man who dared to reshape the world, and whose legacy continues to cast a long shadow over history. Napoleon's tale wasn't quite the simple rise and fall narrative we've come to expect from historical dramas. Instead, it was more of a roller coaster ride, with twists that would make even the most stoic historian clutch their pearls. Fresh off his unexpected encore performance, the Emperor was back in Paris, ready to take another swing at destiny. It was as if he'd returned to a game of chess, determined to checkmate his adversaries one last time. The 100 Days, as this period became known, was a whirlwind of political savvy and military preparation. Napoleon's charisma worked its magic. Soldiers and civilians alike flocked to his side, captivated by the promise of the glory days. The newly restored Bourbon monarchy, led by the ever-unpopular Louis Roman XVIII, was about as stable as a Jenga tower in an earthquake. As Napoleon advanced, Louis scuttled away to Belgium, proving once again that the French monarchy had a knack for strategic retreats. But the European powers weren't about to let Napoleon's comeback become the feel-good story of the century. The Seventh Coalition, an ensemble cast featuring Britain, Prussia, Austria and Russia, decided to rain on Napoleon's parade. They were like the ultimate party crashers, ready to shut things down before they got out of hand. With the ink barely dry on his return, Napoleon knew he was on borrowed time, and Europe was about to place a definitive bookmark in his story. This all leads us to the battle that would become synonymous with ultimate defeat, Waterloo. Taking place on June 18, 1815, this clash was the culmination of Napoleon's audacity. Facing the Duke of Wellington's Anglo-Allied army and the Prussian forces under Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher, Napoleon found himself in a precarious position. With around 73,000 troops at his command, He was up against a combined enemy force edging towards 180,000, a David versus Goliath scenario, minus the slingshot miracle. The battle unfolded with the kind of chaos that could only be orchestrated by military minds convinced they held the ace up their sleeve. Napoleon launched his attack at 11:30 a.m. A late start due to muddy conditions, Mother Nature's way of reminding us she has a sense of humor. The French forces initially made headway, but Wellington's troops held firm in defensive positions like a boxer absorbing blows before going for the knockout punch. Meanwhile, Blücher's Prussians were closing in like the cavalry in a spaghetti western, only less glamorous and with more mud. Napoleon's hope lay in a classic divide-and-conquer strategy, but as the day wore on, it became clear that fate had dealt him a losing hand. Around 4:30 p.m., French launched a massive cavalry charge against Wellington's center, a spectacle that looked impressive, but achieved little more than a few broken lines and a lot of dead horses. By evening, the Prussians had arrived, hitting Napoleon's right flank and sealing the deal on what would become a disastrous defeat. By 9:00 p.m., Napoleon's forces were in full retreat, and the Emperor himself was left to contemplate his fortunes amidst the wreckage of his ambitions. Waterloo was not just a military defeat. It was a definitive full stop on the story of Napoleon's empire. The battle claimed around 25,000 French casualties, with the Allies losing about 22,000, a grim testament to the brutal costs of war. As the dust settled, Europe's map was set to be redrawn once again, sans the Napoleonic touch. In the aftermath, Napoleon tried to rally support for one last stand, but the jig was up. Facing insurmountable odds and waning support, he abdicated for the second time on June 22, 1815. This time, there were no Mediterranean islands or hopeful returns. Napoleon was shipped off to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, a place as desolate as his political prospects. It was here, under the watchful eye of the British, that the once mighty emperor would spend the rest of his days, brooding and dictating memoirs. And so, the saga of Napoleon Bonaparte came to a close, leaving behind a legacy as complex as the man himself. Was he a revolutionary hero who championed the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity? Or was he a tyrant, blinded by ambition and delusions of grandeur? The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. Napoleon was a man of contradictions, a visionary with a penchant for authoritarianism, a reformer with a taste for conquest. On one hand, Napoleon reshaped Europe with a deftness that was as radical as it was enduring. He introduced the Napoleonic Code, a legal framework that influenced countries far beyond French borders. His administrative reforms modernized the French state, creating foundations that would last long after his fall. He championed meritocracy over aristocratic privilege, a revolutionary ideal that inspired generations. Yet the darker side of Napoleon's legacy can't be ignored. His wars, driven by insatiable ambition, left a trail of devastation across Europe. The human cost was staggering, millions of lives lost, economies disrupted, and societies left to pick up the pieces. Napoleon's quest for glory often overshadowed the very ideals he claimed to uphold, leaving a legacy marked by both triumph and tragedy. In the end, history continues to grapple with the enigma of Napoleon Bonaparte. His life was a testament to the heights of human ambition and the depths of human folly. A Corsican outsider who rose to become the master of Europe, Napoleon's story remains a compelling reminder of the power of vision, the allure of power, and the inescapable realities of human nature. As the years have passed, Napoleon's myth has been both romanticized and vilified. To some, he remains a symbol of revolutionary fervor, a titan who dared to challenge the status quo. To others, he's a cautionary tale of unchecked ambition and hubris. Yet, perhaps the most enduring aspect of Napoleon's legacy is the way it continues to provoke debate, inspire fascination, and remind us that history is never as black and white as it seems. So, next time you hear about a Napoleon complex, or see his iconic silhouette on a museum wall, remember the man behind the myth, a leader whose life was a testament to the complexities of power and the enduring allure of greatness, a figure who, despite his flaws and failures, left an indelible mark on history, one that continues to intrigue, inspire, and challenge us to this day. In the tropical lowlands of present-day Mexico, where heat and humidity are constant companions, a civilization once thrived that was as enigmatic as it was influential: the Olmecs. These folks were the original rock stars of Mesoamerica, quite literally setting the stage for every civilization that followed. Now, before you start thinking of them as just another ancient society with pyramids and cornfields, let's dig into what made them tick, starting with geography, because nothing shapes a society quite like its environment. The Olmecs called the swampy, river-rich lands near the Gulf of Mexico home. And when I say swampy, I mean the kind of wet that makes you wonder why they didn't just invent the umbrella first. This region, known as the Olmec Heartland, stretched across what are now the states of Veracruz and Tabasco. It was a hotbed of both biodiversity and, well, just plain heat. The Olmecs settled here around 1500 BCE, and they didn't just survive, they thrived, crafting a civilization that would lay the groundwork for the Maya, Aztecs, and others. Now, if you're wondering why anyone would pick a place with the climate of a sauna to build a civilization, it all boils down to one thing: rivers. The Coatzacoalcos, Tonalá, and San Juan rivers were the Olmecs' lifelines. They weren't just handy for a quick dip when things got too hot to handle. These waterways were crucial for transportation, irrigation, and most importantly, moving their colossal stone heads. Yes, you heard right. Those gigantic, expressionless heads that have become the unfortunate mascots of the Olmec civilization. We'll get to those in a minute. Back to the rivers. These natural highways allowed the Olmecs to trade jade, obsidian, and rubber with their neighbors. This trade network was the ancient equivalent of having a killer Wi-Fi connection. It kept them in the loop and the goods flowing. But like any good thing, there was a catch. The region's fertile land was prone to flooding, which meant the Olmecs had to become adept at managing their environment. Think of it as early climate change adaptation, minus the global conferences and political squabbles. This brings us to those stone heads. The Olmec heads, giant sculptures carved from basalt boulders that weighed up to 20 tons each. That's about the weight of 10 average cars. These heads were so important to the Olmecs that they dragged them from the Tuxtla Mountains, which, by the way, were about 60 miles away. And they did this without cranes, trucks, or even a decent road. Nope, just good old-fashioned manpower and maybe a few logs as rollers. Talk about a workout plan that would put modern gyms to shame. Now, you might be wondering what drove the Olmecs to create these monumental sculptures. Was it a case of ancient vanity, the rulers wanting to see their likeness immortalized in stone? Or was it something deeper, like a spiritual or political statement? Historians are still scratching their heads on this one, but it's safe to say the Olmecs were making a point. These colossal heads likely represented rulers, their stoic faces serving as both a reminder of power and a warning to outsiders. Kind of like the ancient version of those, beware of dog signs, except, with a 20-ton rock. And let's not forget the logistics nightmare these heads must have caused. Picture a team of laborers trudging through swamps and rivers, all the while trying to keep a gigantic stone from sinking into the mud. It's the kind of operation that would have any modern-day project manager pulling their hair out. But the Olmecs managed it, and in doing so, they left us one of the most intriguing legacies of the ancient world. In the end, these geographical and environmental factors didn't just influence the Olmecs' day-to-day lives. They shaped their entire civilization. They were the silent architects of Olmec society, dictating everything from where they built their villages to how they expressed power and identity. And while the Olmecs might not have left behind the detailed records and grand narratives of later civilizations, the stone heads and their swampy heartland tell a story all their own. A story of adaptation, innovation, and a determination as solid as the basalt they carved. But let's set those stone heads aside for a moment and zoom in on the real human drama that played out in Olmec society. Picture a bustling community where societal roles were as distinct as the carvings on those colossal heads. At the apex of the Olmec hierarchy sat the elite, a mysterious bunch who probably enjoyed the ancient equivalent of VIP seating at every event. These weren't your average Mesoamerican folks. They were the rulers, the priests, and possibly the ones who decided which heads got carved and where they should loom ominously. The Olmec elite were like the directors of a grand, ongoing play, casting themselves in the most crucial roles. They might have worn the fanciest jade jewelry, because nothing says I'm important quite like flaunting some serious green bling. Jade wasn't just a fashion statement. It was a symbol of power, wealth, and a connection to the divine. And speaking of divine, the elite likely played a significant role in religious ceremonies, maybe even claiming to have a heartline to the Olmec guards. Now, if you're thinking the rest of the Olmec society were just extras in this production, think again. Enter the skilled artisans, the true unsung heroes of the Olmec world. These were the folks who transformed raw materials into awe-inspiring works of art and functional tools. Ever wonder who carved those stone heads? Yeah, thank the artisans for making labor look like a form of art. They didn't just chisel stone. They worked with jade, clay, and yes, even rubber. And don't get me started on rubber. That bouncy stuff was more than just a material. It was a game changer. The Olmecs were crafting rubber long before anyone thought to put it on a basketball or sneaker. Imagine them bouncing rubber balls in ritual games that might have been the forerunner to the Mesoamerican ball game. They possibly even used rubber for practical applications, like waterproofing or making shock-absorbing soles for sandals. Talk about stepping up your game, literally. But let's not bounce too far off topic. Below the skilled artisans were the farmers and laborers, the backbone of Olmec society, the folks who kept the whole operation running like a well-oiled machine. These individuals were responsible for producing the food that sustained the entire society. Maize was the crop du jour, but they didn't stop there. The Olmecs were early adopters of the agricultural revolution, cultivating beans, squash, and cacao. Yes, that's right, cacao. The Olmecs might just be the unsung heroes of chocolate lovers everywhere. Take a moment to thank them next time you indulge in a chocolate bar. Now, if you're picturing peaceful farming scenes, think again. Agriculture was no picnic. The flood-prone lands meant that Olmec farmers had to be as adaptable as their crops. They likely developed raised fields to prevent crops from drowning and to make the most of the fertile soil. These farmers were innovators in their own right, and their efforts allowed the Olmec civilization to thrive. Trade was another cornerstone of the Olmec economy. Those rivers we mentioned earlier, they weren't just for the scenic route. They were the arteries of Olmec trade networks, carrying goods like obsidian, jade, and yes, rubber to neighboring regions. It's like the Olmecs had their own version of Amazon Prime, minus the 2-day delivery. This trade wasn't just about exchanging goods. It was about exchanging ideas and culture, too. The Olmecs were influencers before influencing was a thing, spreading their architectural styles and religious practices across Mesoamerica. But let's not romanticize this too much. With trade comes competition, and competition can lead to conflict. The Olmecs likely had their share of disputes over resources and trade routes. Unlike the peaceful, communal picture some might paint of ancient societies, the Olmecs were probably as politically savvy and occasionally ruthless as any civilization. The elite might have been the ones calling the shots, but they had to navigate the tricky waters of alliances and rivalries, much like today's political leaders. In the grand scheme of things, the Olmec social structure was a well-oiled machine, each part vital to the whole. From the elite down to the laborers, each individual had a role to play in the success of their civilization. It's a reminder that even in ancient times, a society's prosperity was built on the backs of its people, every single one of them. The Olmec world was one of complexity, innovation, and perhaps a bit of rubber-fueled fun. They may not have left behind the detailed chronicles of their lives, but their legacy is carved in stone and etched into the very fabric of Mesoamerican history. And while we've peeled back a few layers of Olmec society, there's still more to uncover in this ancient civilization's story. We've peeked behind the curtain at the social hierarchy, but what about the spiritual beliefs that tied it all together? Or the mysterious end of this vibrant civilization? Keep your jade jewelry and rubber balls ready, because there's more to this story, and it's about to get even more intriguing. The Olmecs weren't just the original trendsetters of Mesoamerica. They were also the political acrobats of their time, balancing power with the finesse of a Cirque du Soleil performer, minus the spandex and pyrotechnics. These leaders were more than just figureheads with fancy jade bling. They were the puppet masters pulling the strings of a complex political structure that kept the Olmec civilization not just surviving but thriving. Picture them as maestros conducting an orchestra, where every note had to be precisely timed or risk throwing the whole performance into chaos. At the heart of this political symphony were the ceremonial centers. Think of them as the Olmec version of Washington, D.C., but with a lot more stone and a lot less bureaucracy. These centers, like La Venta and San Lorenzo, were the hubs of power, religion, and social life. La Venta, for instance, wasn't just a city, it was a statement in stone. By 900 BCE, it boasted a population that could rival a small modern town, with structures that screamed, "We mean business." The Great Pyramid of La Venta, towering over 100 feet, was the ancient world's equivalent of a skyscraper, visible for miles around as a beacon of Olmec authority. But let's not kid ourselves. These ceremonial centers weren't just about grandeur and religious devotion. They were strategic chess pieces in the Olmecs' game of political domination. By constructing these massive complexes, the Olmec elite were sending a clear message. We are powerful, we are organized, and don't you forget it. It was as much about religious devotion as it was about an ancient form of PR, the kind that didn't involve press releases, but had a similar effect. The rulers orchestrated elaborate ceremonies that were a mix of genuine spiritual practice and a masterclass in crowd control. Imagine a festival with a side of divine intervention where the priestly class convinced the masses that the gods were on their side, thereby legitimizing their rule. In these rituals, the Olmec leaders probably donned the most extravagant of costumes. Think feathers, jade, and an air of authority that could part a crowd like the Red Sea. They might have claimed to commune directly with deities, essentially acting as the middlemen between the divine and the mortal. It's a classic power play. If you can make people believe you have the gods on speed dial, your political stock is bound to rise. The ceremonial practices serve to reinforce the social hierarchy, reminding everyone of their place in the cosmic order. And while we might never know the exact details of these rituals, we can be pretty sure they involved a lot of smoke, mirrors, and possibly a dash of theatrical flair. Now, let's talk about the Olmecs' religious beliefs, which were as complex as a modern tax code. They worshipped a pantheon of gods that represented natural elements and animals, blending the tangible with the ethereal. The most iconic among them was the jaguar god, a feline deity that was both feared and revered. The jaguar, a symbol of power and mystery, perfectly embodied the duality of Olmec religion, a mix of awe and terror. This religion wasn't just a Sunday affair. It was intertwined with every aspect of Olmec life, from politics to agriculture. However, the line between genuine spiritual belief and shrewd political maneuvering was as thin as an artisan's chisel. The Olmec elite knew that religion could be a powerful tool for maintaining control. By intertwining religious ideology with governance, they crafted a system where questioning the leaders was akin to questioning the gods themselves. It's a strategy that echoes throughout history, where rulers have often turned to divine right to justify their actions and keep dissent at bay. But here's where the Olmecs truly shine in their myth-busting glory. They weren't just a one-trick pony of politics and religion. Their leaders had to navigate a labyrinth of economic and social challenges that would make any modern politician break into a cold sweat. The Olmec heartland was a hotspot for natural resources, but managing these assets required a deft touch. The prosperity of the region depended heavily on the successful management of trade networks, agricultural production, and resource distribution. Leaders had to ensure that the flow of obsidian, jade, and other valuables continued uninterrupted, keeping their society well supplied and their neighbors on friendly terms, or at least not openly hostile. This balancing act wasn't without its pitfalls. The Olmecs had to be as adaptable as they were strategic, constantly adjusting their policies to account for shifting alliances and environmental changes. It was a high-stakes game of political chess, where one wrong move could destabilize the entire region. And let's not forget the ever-present threat of rival civilizations eager to claim a piece of the Olmec pie. The leaders had to be as crafty in their diplomacy as they were in their religious ceremonies, ensuring that their neighbors were either allies or too intimidated to challenge them. As we delve deeper into the Olmec political structure, it's clear that their leaders were more than just ceremonial figureheads. They were the architects of a society that was as sophisticated as it was enduring, laying the groundwork for future Mesoamerican civilizations to build upon. The Olmecs' ability to weave together politics, religion, and economic prowess created a tapestry of power that was as intricate as the jade jewelry they prized. But like any great story, there's still more to uncover, more layers to peel back, and more mysteries to solve. So, hold onto your jade amulets and prepare for the next chapter in this ancient saga, where we'll explore the rise and eventual fade of this enigmatic civilization. And just when you think you've got the Olmecs all figured out, they throw you a curveball with their artistry and those so-called mysterious glyphs that have historians playing a millennia-long game of charades. Now, if you've ever seen an Olmec artifact, you'll know they weren't exactly scribbling stick figures. Their art was as intricate as a politician's alibi, crafted with a precision that still makes scholars scratch their heads, and not just because they're wearing hats. Let's kick things off with their architecture and head to San Lorenzo, one of the Olmecs' major centers, where around 1150 BCE they redefined what it meant to be extra. Picture a sprawling complex, not just serving as a home for the elite, but a statement piece, like the ancient equivalent of a billionaire's mansion with way more cultural clout. These structures were built with basalt, transported from the Tuxtla Mountains over 60 miles away. And remember, this was before the invention of the wheel. Yeah, let that sink in like a 20-ton stone head into a swamp. But it wasn't just about the architecture. It was about what these buildings represented. They were the physical manifestation of the Olmec's social and religious hierarchies. The colossal stone heads, for instance, weren't just decorative garden gnomes. These were the Olmec equivalent of having your portrait painted, intended to immortalize the rulers and possibly intimidate anyone who dared to question their authority. It's like a prehistoric version of putting your face on a billboard, minus the Photoshop. Switching gears to art, the Olmecs weren't just chiseling stone and calling it a day. No, they were the Mesoamerican Michelangelos, working with jade, clay, and basalt to create pieces that were both functional and fabulous. Jade, in particular, was their material of choice, and it wasn't just because it looked pretty. It was believed to have spiritual significance, a direct line to the divine, if you will. So when an Olmec artist carved a jade mask, they weren't just making a fashion statement, they were crafting a piece of eternity. Now, it's time to tackle the enigma that is the Olmec writing system, or rather, the lack of one, or at least one we can fully understand. The Olmecs left behind symbols and glyphs that have more in common with modern art than with any decipherable language. It's the kind of thing that makes linguists and archaeologists lose sleep, trying to figure out if they were staring at a grocery list or a divine proclamation. Though some suspect these glyphs could be the earliest form of writing in the Americas, others argue they might be more symbolic than linguistic. It's like trying to decode a tweet from a celebrity and wondering if there's a hidden message behind those emojis. But here's the kicker. While the Olmecs were busy being mysterious, they unintentionally became the trendsetters of Mesoamerica. Later civilizations like the Maya and Aztecs took a page, or a stone tablet, out of the Olmec playbook. In a way, the Olmecs were the original influencers, inspiring centuries of artistic and architectural borrowings. And let's be real, when it comes to culture, who hasn't borrowed a bit from the classics? It's just that in this case, the classics were carved in stone and weighed a couple of tons. The Olmec legacy didn't stop at art and architecture. They also laid the groundwork for the spiritual and ceremonial practices that would echo through the ages. Their religious motifs, from jaguar deities to feathered serpents, slithered their way into the pantheons of later civilizations. It's like they handed down a spiritual starter kit, complete with a guide on how to appease the gods and possibly terrify your enemies in the process. But let's not get too caught up in the romanticism of it all. The Olmecs were busy crafting masterpieces and spiritual legacies. They were also navigating the harsh realities of their existence. The truth is, the Olmec civilization was as much about survival as it was about spirituality. Their ability to adapt to their environment and innovate was crucial. They were like the ultimate multitaskers, balancing religious duties with the day-to-day grind of keeping a civilization afloat. And now, as we dig deeper into the Olmec world, we see a civilization that was anything but simple. Their contributions to art and culture were monumental, quite literally, but they were also part of a complex web of social, political, and environmental factors. So, as we continue to unravel the mysteries of the Olmecs, Let's remember that behind every stone head and jade figurine was a society striving to leave its mark on history, with a chisel, not a pen. And isn't that the real kicker? For all their grandeur, they left us more questions than answers, like a historical cliffhanger begging for its next chapter. Stay tuned, because the Olmec saga is far from over. And now, as we dig deeper into the Olmec world, we see a civilization that was anything but simple. Their contributions to art and culture were monumental, quite literally, but they were also part of a complex web of social, political, and environmental factors. So, as we continue to unravel the mysteries of the Olmecs, let's remember that behind every stone head and jade figurine was a society striving to leave its mark on history, with a chisel, not a pen. And isn't that the real kicker? For all their grandeur, they left us more questions than answers, like a historical cliffhanger begging for its next chapter. Stay tuned, because the Olmec saga is far from over. But even the most mesmerizing stories have to face the cold reality of an ending. And for the Olmecs, it wasn't a gentle fade to black, but more of a dramatic exit stage left. By around 400 BCE, the Olmec civilization was on the wane, a decline shrouded in just as much mystery as their colossal heads. So what happened? Did they just pack it up and decide to try their luck elsewhere? Not quite. Let's dive into the factors that led to the fall of these ancient trendsetters. First up, Mother Nature decided to throw a few curveballs. The Olmec heartland, with its lush yet temperamental climate, was a double-edged sword. Those same rivers that once boosted their thriving trade networks became less reliable, thanks to environmental shifts. Floods and droughts played havoc with agriculture, and when your society is built on maize and cacao, a bad harvest isn't just a bummer, it's a crisis. Add to this the possibility of soil exhaustion from overfarming, and you've got a recipe for economic and social upheaval. Speaking of social factors, internal strife might have also played a starring role in this historical drama. Remember those elite folks with the jade bling and private heartline to the guards? Well, power struggles among the ruling classes can be as destabilizing as a volcanic eruption. As resources became scarce, the political harmony that had once glued the Olmec society might have begun to crack. There's only so much divine intervention can do when your subjects are hungry and your rivals are eyeing your throne. And let's not forget the impact of external pressures. The Olmecs were not alone in Mesoamerica, and their neighbors weren't exactly sending over casseroles to help them through tough times. Emerging civilizations, eager to carve out their own territories, could have added to the Olmec woes. When your neighbors start sharpening their metaphorical knives, it's time to rethink your strategy or face the consequences. So, the Olmec civilization began to unravel, and as it did, it set off a chain reaction. The great ceremonial centers of La Venta and San Lorenzo, once bustling hubs of activity, likely saw a downturn in their relevance. Population centers dispersed, and the Olmec influence waned, leaving behind a rich cultural legacy that would echo through the ages. While their cities crumbled, their ideas didn't vanish. They were absorbed, adapted, and reborn in the civilizations that followed. Now, here's where the myth and reality tango. The romantic notion of a once great civilization disappearing into the mist has its appeal, but the truth is typically less glamorous. The Olmecs didn't just vanish, they evolved. Their descendants and cultural influences hopped up in the Zapotecs, Maya, and other Mesoamerican cultures, like the ultimate hand-me-downs of history. The Olmec legacy was like a cultural relay race, passing the baton of knowledge and tradition down the line. It's a reminder that history doesn't move in a straight line. It's more of a zigzag, with pit stops and occasional detours. The Olmecs, for all their grandeur and mystery, were part of a larger story, one of adaptation and resilience. They remind us that civilizations are not immortal. They are as subject to change as the tides, and as vulnerable as the crops they depend on. And as we sit here in the 21st century, sipping our coffee and checking the latest news on our smartphones, it's hard not to draw some parallels. Environmental challenges, political unrest, and societal shifts sound familiar. The Olmecs faced them, and so do we. It's a testament to the cyclical nature of history, where the same themes replay, albeit with different actors and settings. As the saying goes, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Except this time, we have the benefit of hindsight, and maybe a few more technological gadgets. In the end, The Olmec story is a tale of human innovation and tenacity, of a society that thrived against the odds and left an indelible mark on the world. They were the original Mesoamerican pioneers, carving out a legacy in stone that still captures our imagination. And while their civilization may have declined, their influence lives on, a testament to the enduring power of human creativity and resilience. So next time you marvel at a piece of art or ponder the mysteries of ancient societies, remember the Olmecs, the original rock stars of Mesoamerica, who knew how to make an entrance and an exit that still has us talking centuries later. In the vast tapestry of history, few tales are as audaciously ambitious as that of the Ottoman Empire. Imagine starting with nothing more than a scrappy band of warriors and turning it into one of the largest empires the world has ever seen. That's the magic trick Osman I pulled off in the late 13th century. Our story begins not in the grandeur of Istanbul, but in the rugged terrain of Anatolia, where Osman, a chieftain of a small Turkish tribe, laid the groundwork for an empire that would eventually span 3 continents. Osman I, whose name would become the very foundation of the Ottoman identity, was something of an underdog. Born around 1258, he ruled what was essentially a glorified gang of mercenaries. But hey, don't underestimate the power of a good rebranding. From this modest start, Osman managed to carve out a small but growing slice of territory from the crumbling Byzantine Empire. Little did anyone suspect that this would eventually become a juggernaut that, at its peak, would control lands from the gates of Vienna to the sandy stretches of Arabia. Now, let's talk about innovation, because Osman and his successors weren't just resting on their laurels. The Ottomans were early adopters, a bit like history's tech startup that couldn't stop scaling. Their military prowess was nothing short of legendary. This was not your average medieval army. The Ottomans brought something new to the battlefield with their use of gunpowder, a game changer that transformed their military strategies. By the 15th century, they were packing cannons that would make your local fireworks display look like a sparklers-only affair. And then there were the Janissaries, the elite infantry units that were the stuff of legend and a little bit of myth. Recruited from Christian boys taken as a form of tax known as the devshirme, they were trained from a young age to be loyal only to the Sultan. Think of them as the original special forces, but with more pointy hats and less camo. These guys were the backbone of the Ottoman military might, and their influence was felt across the empire. But let's not polish the myth too brightly. Yes, they were formidable, but they were also a bit of a double-edged sword, often meddling in politics and occasionally usurping the Sultan himself. So much for loyalty, right? But it wasn't just about the military. The Ottomans knew that an empire is only as strong as its economy. They capitalized on their prime real estate, controlling key trade routes and taxing everything that moved through their lands. They turned Istanbul, once Constantinople, cue the catchy tune, into a bustling hub of commerce. The Ottoman economy was like a well-oiled machine, a machine that ran on silk, spices, and a healthy dose of commerce-driven ambition. By the 16th century, when Suleiman the Magnificent took the throne, the empire was truly in its golden age, with wealth flowing in from all corners of its vast dominions. Suleiman, now there's a guy who knew how to make an entrance. Ruling from 1520 to 1566, he wasn't just a sultan, he was a superhero of sorts, with a resume that would make any overachiever blush. Under his reign, the empire not only expanded its borders, but also underwent a cultural renaissance. Architecture, literature, and the arts flourished. The Ottomans were not just about swords and conquests. They also built mosques that kissed the clouds and palaces that whispered tales of opulence and power. Geography played a significant role in the Ottoman narrative too. Sitting at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, the empire was like the cool kid at the global party, mingling effortlessly between East and West. This strategic position allowed them to control the lucrative Silk Road trade, essentially acting as the toll booth operators of the ancient world. It's no wonder the empire was rolling in riches, while European powers were still figuring out how to navigate the 7 seas without getting lost. But let's not get too starry-eyed here. The empire's rise was not a smooth ride. It faced internal strife, rebellions, and the perennial challenge of governing such a vast territory. The Janissaries, remember them. They were both a blessing and a curse, demanding more power as the years went on. While Suleiman was busy being magnificent, his successors often found themselves struggling to fill his rather large shoes. The Ottoman saga is one of ambition and innovation, but also of intrigue and betrayal. It's a reminder that empires are built not just on the strength of their armies or the wealth of their coffers, but on the vision and cunning of their leaders. So, as we delve deeper into the rise and fall of this empire, keep in mind that history is a complex dance of power, ambition, and a whole lot of luck. And sometimes, as the Ottomans teach us, even the mightiest of empires can start with something as humble as a chieftain's dream in the Anatolian hills. So, as we tiptoe into the glittering halls of the Ottoman Empire at its zenith, prepare yourself for a social and political labyrinth that even the most seasoned strategist would find daunting. Picture a sprawling empire where power wasn't just centralized in the hands of one sultan, but cleverly dispersed through a complex hierarchy, all designed to keep the wheels of governance spinning smoothly. It was a bit like a medieval corporate structure, complete with department heads and middle managers, but with more turbans and fewer PowerPoint presentations. At the heart of this intricate system was the Sultan's court, a place of opulence, intrigue, and occasionally scandalous drama. The Sultan himself, the ultimate authority, was flanked by an advisory council known as the Divan. This was no mere gathering of yes-men. It included the Grand Vizier, essentially the empire's COO, who could wield significant power and even speak on behalf of the Sultan. Think of the Grand Vizier as the one person in the empire who could tell the boss no without losing his head, though he'd have to be very, very careful about it. The political chessboard of the Ottoman court was further complicated by the presence of the harem, a term that conjures images of silk-clad women lounging in luxury, but the reality was both more mundane and more politically charged. The harem was not just a place for the Sultan's wives and concubines. It was a breeding ground for power plays and alliances. These women, often politically astute and highly educated, wielded influence behind the scenes. A clever consort could elevate her son to the position of Sultan, steering the empire's future. It was like a cutthroat reality show with stakes higher than any tribal council. But let's not get swept away by the romanticized version of the harem. Sure, it makes for great TV, but the reality was often far less glamorous. Many women were brought in from conquered lands, their lives entirely upended. Some found ways to thrive, but others were essentially prisoners in a gilded cage. It's a stark reminder that glamour and oppression can sometimes walk hand in hand. Religion played a key role in this grand tapestry, too. Islam was the state religion, and the Sultan was seen as the caliph, the religious leader of all Muslims. The Ottomans managed to weave religious authority into their governance, giving their rule a divine legitimacy. But they were also surprisingly pragmatic about religion. Non-Muslims, known as dhimmis, were allowed to practice their faiths, albeit with a tax for the privilege. This policy of relative tolerance, though driven as much by economic necessity as benevolence, was crucial for maintaining stability across the empire's diverse populations. Culturally, the Ottomans were like magpies, picking the shiniest bits from the various cultures they encountered and incorporating them into their own. This cultural syncretism was most evident in their art, architecture, and literature. Ottoman architecture, for example, was a jaw-dropping blend of Byzantine and Islamic influences, reaching its zenith in the 16th century with masterpieces like the Süleymaniye Mosque in Istanbul. This architectural marvel, completed in 1557, wasn't just a place of worship. It was a symbol of Ottoman grandeur and a testament to their engineering prowess. The empire's cultural achievements also extended to music and literature, where they left an indelible mark. Ottoman poetry and music were heavily influenced by Persian and Arabic traditions, yet distinctively Ottoman in their execution. This cultural richness was not just for show. It was a tool of soft power, projecting the empire's image as a sophisticated and enlightened civilization. As for their influence on European politics, the Ottomans were the elephant in the room that no one could ignore. European nations were simultaneously fascinated and terrified by the Ottomans. They were the other, the exotic danger at the edge of Christendom. But they were also a critical trading partner, and diplomatic relations were a delicate dance of alliances and rivalries. The Ottomans were experts at playing European powers against each other, a geopolitical strategy that allowed them to maintain their influence well into the late 17th century. Yet, despite all this sophistication and power, the Ottoman Empire was not immune to the age-old pitfalls of overexpansion and internal corruption. As the empire grew, so did the layers of bureaucracy and the potential for inefficiency. The Janissaries, once the Sultan's fiercest loyalists, became increasingly unruly, demanding higher wages and more power. It was a classic case of the guards thinking they could run the prison. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. There's still much to unravel in the saga of the Ottomans. The empire's social and political structures were both its greatest strengths and its Achilles' heel, setting the stage for the dramatic turns that would follow. Stay tuned as we continue to delve deeper into the ambitious, tumultuous, and occasionally scandalous world of the Ottoman Empire. We've only just begun to scratch the surface of their monumental rise and eventual decline. And speaking of scratching the surface, let's dig a bit deeper into the Ottoman Empire's economic engine, or perhaps more accurately, its somewhat rickety economic roller coaster. Sure, the Ottomans were sitting pretty at the crossroads of major trade routes, but maintaining an empire that large wasn't exactly a stroll through the Grand Bazaar. Picture managing a global corporation where your employees are scattered across 3 continents, each with their own expense accounts and a penchant for creative accounting. Welcome to the world of Ottoman economics, my friends. First off, let's talk trade routes. The Ottomans were the gatekeepers of the Silk Road, the ancient highway of commerce that linked the East and the West. We're talking everything from silk and spices to the occasional exotic animal. Basically, if it was shiny or smelled good, the Ottomans had their hands on it. This lucrative position allowed them to rake in tolls like a champion bridge operator. But there was a catch. As European powers like Portugal and Spain figured out how to sail around Africa, the Silk Road started to look a little less shiny and more like yesterday's news. Shipping goods by sea was cheaper and faster, and suddenly the Ottomans found themselves with a lot less traffic at their toll booths. Awkward. And then there's the infamous Ottoman bureaucracy, a system so complex it made a Rube Goldberg machine look like a paperclip. This was an empire built on layers of administration, with each province and city having its own set of officials, all of whom needed to be paid. The famous tax farmers, or as I like to call them, medieval IRS agents with even less charm, were responsible for collecting taxes from the empire's vast and varied populations. The system was efficient in theory, but ripe for corruption in practice. Picture a game of telephone where everyone's whispering about their cut of the taxes, and you get the idea. Now, let's get into the nitty-gritty of Ottoman fiscal policies, which were a delightful mix of ingenuity and desperation. One of their more creative solutions to budget shortfalls was the debasement of currency. The Ottomans, like many before them, couldn't resist the allure of shaving a little precious metal off their coins to make a quick buck, or rather, to make several quick bucks out of one. This was great for short-term cash flow, but not so hot for long-term economic stability. Inflation ensued, and suddenly a loaf of bread cost more than a camel ride across the desert. But wait, it gets better. The Ottomans also embraced the concept of tax farming, where they essentially outsourced tax collection to the highest bidder. This was a bit like hiring a fox to guard the henhouse and then being surprised when all the chickens go missing. These tax farmers would pay the government for the right to collect taxes, and then, naturally, squeeze the populace for more than their fair share to turn a profit. This practice led to widespread resentment and occasional uprisings, as you might imagine. Despite these hiccups, there was a certain genius to Ottoman administration. They managed to keep the empire running relatively smoothly through a combination of delegation and a healthy fear of the Sultan's wrath. The Grand Vizier, as mentioned, was the empire's COO, but beneath him was a sprawling network of local officials who managed everything from infrastructure to justice. This decentralized system allowed the Ottomans to govern diverse populations with a certain degree of flexibility. Until, of course, it didn't. And then there's the question of the Ottoman Golden Age. Suleiman the Magnificent's reign, often painted as a time of unparalleled prosperity and cultural flowering. But let's not get too carried away by the glitz and glamour. Sure, the empire was rolling in wealth, but it was also spending at an alarming rate. maintaining an army to defend its vast borders, funding grand architectural projects, and keeping the bureaucracy well-oiled were costly endeavors. The empire was like a high roller who always picked up the tab but never checked the balance. The challenges of maintaining such a sprawling empire were many, and the cost was steep. Over time, the weight of its own grandeur began to press down on the Ottomans. The empire's golden age was not an unbroken period of bliss, but rather a peak from which it would begin a slow and complex decline. The seeds of this decline were already being sown in its reliance on a vast bureaucracy, a fickle economy, and a military that was as much a political player as a defensive force. So, as we pull back from this whirlwind tour of Ottoman economics, remember that the empire's rise and fall were not dictated solely by the whims of its rulers or the might of its armies. The Ottoman saga is a story of ambition and innovation, sure, but also of economic realities that could neither be ignored nor sugar-coated. The empire was a magnificent beast, both awe-inspiring and unwieldy, held together by a delicate balance of power, finance, and the occasional stroke of luck. And as we continue to explore the intricate dance of history, let's keep an eye on those economic undercurrents that have shaped, and will continue to shape, the stories of empires and nations alike. Stay tuned for more twists and turns in the Ottoman tale. As we sail further into the labyrinthine saga of the Ottoman Empire, let's take a hard look at how things started to unravel. Picture an empire that was once the envy of Europe, now caught in a slow-motion nosedive that even the best PR couldn't spin into a success story. The Ottoman decline wasn't some sudden, catastrophic downfall, but a drawn-out process, a bit like watching a once great band struggle through a reunion tour with none of the original members left. Let's kick things off with military defeats, the kind that make you rethink your life choices. The Battle of Lepanto in 1571 was a wake-up call louder than a cannon blast. Here, the Ottomans faced off against the Holy League, a coalition of European powers who decided it was time to put a stop to Ottoman naval dominance in the Mediterranean. The result? The Ottoman fleet was decimated, losing about 200 ships. The psychological blow was even bigger. Think of it as the empire's equivalent of failing to make it past the audition stage of a talent show. Sure, they rebuilt their navy, but the aura of invincibility had taken a hit. Fast forward to the late 17th century, and the Battle of Vienna in 1683. If Lepanto was a slap on the wrist, Vienna was a punch to the gut. The Ottomans, led by Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa, laid siege to Vienna, hoping to extend their influence further into Europe. But the tables turned when a coalition of European forces, including the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth under King John Roman III Sobieski, came to Vienna's rescue. The Ottomans were not just defeated, they were routed. It was a strategic blunder that signaled the beginning of the end for Ottoman expansion in Europe. The defeat at Vienna was a watershed moment, a reminder that even the mightiest empire could be humbled by a cavalry charge and a bit of Polish panache. The military setbacks were just the tip of the iceberg. Back home, internal strife was brewing. The Janissaries, once the Sultan's elite troops, were now more like a rogue mercenary group with delusions of grandeur. Their constant meddling in palace politics and demands for higher wages made them as much a liability as an asset. Imagine your security detail demanding a say in your family dinner plans, and you've got the right idea. Add to this the impact of European colonialism, which was spreading across the globe like an Instagram trend. The Ottomans, who used to control the world's trade choke points, found themselves sidelined as European powers discovered sea routes to Asia and the Americas. The Portuguese and Dutch were now the kids with the coolest new toys, leaving the Ottomans to reminisce about the good old days. As European powers grew richer from colonies and global trade, the Ottoman economy started to look like a relic of a bygone era, struggling to keep pace with the changing world. Now, let's talk modernization and reform, a noble endeavor that often ended in spectacular failure. The 19th century saw the Ottomans trying to catch up with the West, embarking on a series of reforms known as the Tanzimat. These were grand attempts to modernize the army, administration, and legal system. Picture a midlife crisis on a national scale, complete with the Ottoman version of sports cars and trendy haircuts. The Tanzimat reforms included everything from abolishing the Janissary Corps Finally, to attempting to establish a more meritocratic bureaucracy. The empire introduced new civil codes, inspired by the French, and revamped its military with European training and advisors. But here's the kicker. While these reforms were ambitious, they often clashed with entrenched interests and cultural resistance. The empire was trying to build a modern nation-state on the foundation of an ancient empire, and it was like trying to teach an old dog new tricks while the dog was still chewing on the empire's slippers. In the economic sphere, the Ottomans borrowed heavily from European banks to fund infrastructure projects like railroads and telegraphs. It was a bit like taking out a high-interest loan to renovate your house, only to find out you didn't really understand how electricity works. These projects did modernize parts of the empire, but they also left the Ottomans in a precarious financial position, heavily indebted to European creditors. The reforms also aimed to address the empire's diverse population. The Ottomans attempted to foster a sense of Ottomanism, encouraging different ethnic and religious groups to identify with the empire rather than their own communities. It was a nice idea on paper, but in practice, it was like trying to get cats and dogs to agree on a favorite movie. The inherent tensions between these groups often led to conflict, further destabilizing the already shaky political situation. By the late 19th century, the Young Turks, a reformist group, emerged with the aim of salvaging the empire. Their 1908 revolution restored the constitution suspended by Sultan Abdul Hamid Roman II, heralding a brief period of hope and progress. But even the Young Turks couldn't fully steer the ship away from the iceberg. Internal divisions and world war would soon put an end to any dreams of a revitalized empire. Speaking of World War I, the Ottomans found themselves on the losing side, allied with the Central Powers. The war was a disaster for the empire, culminating in the 1915 Gallipoli campaign, a failed attempt by the Allies to secure a sea route to Russia, which the Ottomans managed to defend. Despite this victory, the war drained the empire's resources and morale. By the time the war ended in 1918, the Ottoman Empire was teetering on the edge of collapse, its territories carved up by the victorious Allies like a Thanksgiving turkey. Let's not forget the human cost of this decline. The empire's diverse population faced significant hardships, from economic instability to the horrors of war. The Armenian genocide of 1915 remains one of the darkest chapters in Ottoman history, a grim reminder of the atrocities that can occur when an empire is in turmoil. So, as we stand at the brink of the Ottoman Empire's final act, it's clear that the decline was a complex interplay of military defeats, internal strife, and the relentless march of European colonialism. The empire's attempts at modernization were bold, but often bungled, leaving it caught between a glorious past and an uncertain future. But hold onto your fez. This isn't the final curtain call for our Ottoman Odyssey. In Part 5, we'll delve into the empire's ultimate dissolution and the birth of modern Turkey. So, stay tuned for more as we explore the final chapters of this once mighty empire's story. There are still lessons to be learned and stories to be told from the remnants of an empire that stretched across continents and centuries. As the dust settled after World War I, the Ottoman Empire found itself on the losing side of history, left to pick up the pieces of a shattered realm. The 1918 Armistice of Mudros was less of a peace treaty and more of a formal acknowledgement that the empire was officially out of luck, out of time, and quite frankly, out of excuses. The Allied powers, smelling blood in the water, swooped in to carve up the Ottoman territories like vultures at a buffet. Fast forward a few years, and the 1920 Treaty of Sevres was signed, which effectively sealed the empire's fate, leaving it with nothing more than a sliver of Anatolia and a hefty pile of resentment. Enter Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, the man with a mission to transform the remnants of the Ottoman Empire into something new, something modern. Picture Ataturk as a kind of historical makeover artist, armed not with a makeup brush, but with a vision of secular nationalism. In 1923, he officially declared the Republic of Turkey, a nation-state rising from the ashes of imperial collapse. The Ottoman sultans, with their turbans and tales of grandeur, were promptly shown the door, as Ataturk set about implementing reforms that would drag Turkey, sometimes kicking and screaming, into the 20th century. Ataturk's reforms were as sweeping as they were ambitious. He abolished the caliphate, the office that had once conferred religious legitimacy on the Ottoman sultans, sending a clear message that Turkey would be a secular state. The fez, that iconic symbol of Ottoman identity, was banned, replaced by more Western headgear, an act that symbolized the break from the past more than 1,000 speeches ever could. He overhauled the legal system, adopting a civil code modeled on the Swiss system, and introduced a new alphabet, replacing the Arabic script with a Latin-based one to boost literacy and align Turkey more closely with the West. It was change on a scale that would make even the most radical innovators blush. Economically, Ataturk was no slouch either. He aimed to modernize Turkey's infrastructure, focusing on industrialization and the establishment of state-controlled enterprises. The goal, to turn Turkey into a self-sufficient nation, free from the economic dependencies that had hamstrung the Ottomans. It's worth noting that the transition wasn't all smooth sailing. The Great Depression hit Turkey hard, just as it did the rest of the world, testing Ataturk's economic policies. But the groundwork for modernization was laid, setting the stage for future growth. Now, let's talk about myths and legacies, because the Ottoman Empire left behind more than just a trail of historical footnotes. The romanticized image of the empire as a glittering jewel of Islamic power and cultural sophistication still holds sway in popular imagination. But let's not kid ourselves. The reality was far messier. The empire was a patchwork of ethnicities and languages, held together by a combination of strategic marriages, military might, and a bureaucracy that would make even the most dedicated paper pusher weep. The Ottomans were both tolerant rulers and oppressive overlords, a duality that defies simple categorization. So, what lessons can we glean from this epic saga? For one, empires are not eternal. The Ottoman story reminds us that even the most formidable powers can crumble under the weight of their own contradictions. The empire's downfall was a complex interplay of internal decay, external pressure, and the relentless march of time. It's a cautionary tale for any power that believes itself immune to the forces of history. But let's not overlook the empire's contributions. The Ottomans were cultural magpies, gathering and synthesizing influences from across their vast domains. Their architectural achievements, like the breathtaking Suleimani Mosque, stand as testaments to their artistic vision and engineering prowess. Empire's legal and administrative innovations laid the groundwork for modern governance, even as they struggled to keep up with changing times. Today, Turkey's relationship with its Ottoman past is a curious mix of nostalgia and pragmatism. The grandeur of the empire is celebrated in everything from TV dramas to tourism, where visitors flock to Istanbul to wander through the hallowed halls of Topkapi Palace or marvel at the architectural wonder of Hagia Sophia. Yet, the Ottoman legacy is also a source of debate and reflection, as Turkey grapples with its identity as a modern secular state. In the end, the story of the Ottoman Empire is a richly woven tapestry of triumphs and tragedies, a reminder of the transient nature of power and the enduring impact of history. As we close the book on this chapter, let's do so with a nod to the complexities and contradictions that make history so endlessly fascinating. Whether through the lens of romance or reality, the tale of the Ottomans continues to captivate, challenge, and inspire. And as for Turkey, well, it's still writing its own story, one that draws upon the lessons of the past while forging a path towards the future. So here's the scene. It's 509 BC, and Rome's got drama more intense than a reality TV show reunion. The Romans have just given their king, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, the royal boot. And let's be clear, when you're nicknamed Superbus, you're probably not winning any popularity contests. This overthrow wasn't just a mild reshuffling of power. Think of it as the ancient world's version of You're Fired, but with a lot more swords. The Romans, fed up with Tarquin's tyrannical antics, decided they'd had enough of monarchy altogether. They wanted something new, something fresh, something less king-wise. Enter the Roman Republic, stage left. Now, creating a republic was Rome's way of saying, we're done with kings who think they're all that. But what does a republic actually look like in ancient Rome? Well, they didn't have a ready-made government template from the local office supply store, so they started with a senate. And no, this wasn't just a bunch of guys in togas sitting around debating whether Caesar salad should have anchovies. The senate was like the ultimate club for the Roman elite, but instead of velvet ropes, they had real power. These senators weren't just there to chat and sip wine. They were the power brokers of Rome. They decided on big issues like war and peace, alliances, and how to keep the plebs from rioting over bread prices. Alongside this Senate, they had the consuls. Picture the consuls as co-CEOs of Rome, with a one-year term so they couldn't get too big for their sandals. There were always two consuls, probably because the Romans believed that if you were going to have a power struggle, you might as well make it a duet. The consuls had the power to veto each other, which sounds a lot like a sibling rivalry, but with more at stake than who gets the top bunk. But why all this fuss over checks and balances? Well, the Romans were pretty clever. They realized that if you give one guy too much power, next thing you know, he's declaring himself dictator for life, and everything goes downhill from there. They wanted to nip that in the bud, a move that makes you wonder if they had a crystal ball to see the future, because, spoiler alert, Rome would have a few issues with dictators later on. Now, let's talk about this thing called freedom in the Roman Republic. It wasn't exactly the freedom we'd recognize today. In fact, if you were a Roman citizen who didn't own land or have a family tree full of senators, your version of freedom was pretty limited. Sure, you were free from having a king, but that didn't mean you were free from the control of the elite. It was more like, you're free to do what we say, and if you don't like it, well, tough. Despite this, we can't deny that the Roman Republic was a fascinating experiment in governance. These structures of power weren't just plucked from thin air. They were a calculated attempt to balance power between the noble families and the rest of Rome, ensuring that no one could easily claim the title of king again. The Romans were essentially trying to build a political system that could withstand human nature, a tall order, given the number of ambitious people who roamed the streets of Rome. And while we love to glorify this period as the dawn of Roman greatness, it wasn't all marble columns and philosophical debates. The reality was gritty and often unfair. The Senate was an exclusive club, and the consuls were usually drawn from the same pool of elite families. The common Roman citizen, or plebeian, was often left to deal with high taxes, military service, and the whims of the rich and powerful. So, the birth of the Roman Republic was less about liberating the masses and more about reshuffling power among the elites. Romans had their own unique way of doing things, and while they might not have invented democracy as we know it, they certainly laid down some intriguing groundwork. And thus, the stage was set for centuries of political maneuvering, social upheaval, and a few too many daggers in the back. But that's a story for another time. Now, just when you thought the Roman Republic was all about the well-heeled elite sipping their ancient equivalent of champagne and deciding the fate of Rome, let's zoom in on the social fabric that was less silk and more burlap, the plebeians and patricians. Think of these two groups like high school cliques, but with a lot more at stake and who sits at the cool lunch table. The patricians were the OG Romans, the aristocrats who could trace their lineage back to the original senators appointed by Romulus himself. They were the kind of folks who had family crests and probably spent their weekends at exclusive toga galas. On the other side of the amphitheater were the plebeians. These were the common folk, the working class, the backbone of Rome's economy who had to navigate the Roman world without the privilege of a family tree that read like a who's who of Roman history. Now, if you think this sounds like the setup for some juicy drama, you'd be right. The plebeians, tired of being the underdogs, wanted their slice of the Roman pie. And by pie, I mean political power, legal rights, and a little respect from the toga-wearing crowd. Cue the conflict of the orders, a struggle that lasted from 494 BC to 287 BC, a solid 200-year soap opera. At its heart, it was a series of social conflicts between the haves and the have-nots. It was like a game of chess, but with a lot more shouting and the occasional riot. The plebeians, fed up with being taxed into oblivion and having no real say in government, decided to take a stand. And by stand, I mean they literally walked out of Rome in a move known as the First Secession of the Plebs. Imagine thousands of people saying, "Fine, you do it without us," and marching off to the sacred mount. Spoiler alert. Rome quickly realized that having no one to do the actual work was a problem. The power dynamic began to shift when the plebeians demanded and got their own representatives, enter the tribunes of the plebs. These tribunes weren't just there to make up the numbers. They had real power. They could veto decisions made by the Senate and the consuls. This was a seismic shift in Roman politics, a bit like giving the underdog a megaphone and a vote. And here's the kicker. The tribunes were considered sacrosanct. Anyone who harmed a tribune could be put to death. That's a pretty effective deterrent, wouldn't you say? The plebeians' quest for equality wasn't just about political power, though. They wanted legal transparency. Enter the 12 Tables around 450 BC. This was Rome's first attempt at a code of law. Picture it as the ancient world's version of a FAQ section, carved into stone tablets and displayed in the Roman Forum for all to see. The 12 Tables were a big deal because they took legal proceedings out of the back rooms and into the public eye. No more secret handshakes or noble privilege, at least in theory. But let's not romanticize this too much. The laws weren't exactly progressive. They were more about codifying existing customs and ensuring everyone knew the rules, even if the rules weren't always fair. And speaking of fairness, the 12 Tables had their quirks. For example, if a debtor couldn't pay up, they could be cut into pieces. Yes, you heard that right. Divided up like a pizza. Talk about harsh penalties. Now, while these laws might seem draconian, they did symbolize a step toward a fairer society, at least by ancient standards. They were a public acknowledgement that the law applied to everyone, even if it applied a little more painfully to some. But for all the progress, the Roman Republic wasn't about to hand over the keys to the kingdom. Citizenship in Rome was less about toga parties and more about tax obligations and military service. Being a Roman citizen came with perks, a vote in the assembly, protection under the law, but it also meant you were on the hook for taxes and could be drafted into the legions. It was a trade-off, like getting a membership card that also signed you up for mandatory meetings. As for the tribunes, they became a force to be reckoned with. Their power grew, and they became the champions of the plebeians, fighting for rights and fairness, or at least trying to. But here's the thing about power. It attracts ambition like a magnet. Over time, the role of the tribune became a stepping stone for those with political aspirations. The very position created to protect the common man often fell into the hands of those who weren't so common after all. So, while the Roman Republic was busy patting itself on the back for its clever political system, the reality was a bit messier. The conflicts between the patricians and plebeians highlighted a society struggling to balance tradition with progress, privilege with fairness. It was a time of social upheaval, legal reforms, and the occasional public riot. A time when shouting the loudest sometimes did make all the difference. And as the Republic strutted into the next few centuries, the stage was set for more political intrigue and social chaos. But that's a tale for later. For now, we've got the plebeians making their voices heard, the patricians trying to hold onto their power, and a republic that's beginning to look like a three-ring circus. Stay tuned, because in Rome, the show is just getting started. As the Republic strutted into the next few centuries, the stage for more political intrigue and social chaos was set. But before the curtain rises on Act Roman 3, let's talk about Rome's expansion, because this republic was not content to sit back and sip wine while watching the Mediterranean world go by. No, Rome had ambitions bigger than a gladiator's biceps. Now, when we say expansion, not talking about a casual stroll through the Italian countryside. We're talking about a full-throttle, boots-on-the-ground, let's conquer anything that moves campaign. By the time the Romans were done, they'd gone from a small city-state to a sprawling empire. And boy, did that come with its own set of headaches. First up, the Punic Wars. These were the blockbuster conflicts between Rome and Carthage, the superpowers of their day. Think of them as the ancient world's Marvel vs. DC showdown, complete with epic battles and a cast of characters worthy of any comic book. The First Punic War kicked off in 264 BC and was all about control of Sicily. The Romans, ever the opportunists, thought, hey, why not? And dove in, eventually snagging Sicily after 23 years of back-and-forth skirmishes. But it was the Second Punic War that really put Rome on the map. And by map, I mean world domination radar. Hannibal, the Carthaginian general who decided that elephants could make excellent mountain climbers. He led his troops, including those famously massive beasts, over the Alps and into Italy, causing panic from the Tiber to the toe of the boot. Spoiler alert, despite some jaw-dropping victories, Hannibal didn't quite manage to topple Rome. The Romans, known for their tenacity, eventually bounced back and took the fight to Carthage's doorstep. By 202 BC, the Romans had Hannibal cornered at the Battle of Zama, and they made sure he knew Rome was not to be trifled with. Scipio Africanus, what a name, right? Led the charge and handed Carthage a defeat so sound that it became the stuff of legend. But here's the gritty reality. Victory wasn't just celebrated with laurel wreaths and grand speeches. Nope, this was capitalism at its finest, Roman style. Property values in Rome skyrocketed as newly acquired territories meant more wealth, more slaves, and more resources flowing into the Republic. So, if you were in the market for Roman real estate, post-Punic Wars was the time to buy. With Carthage out of the way, Rome's appetite for expansion was far from sated. They turned their gaze to the east, where Greece was ripe for the taking. By 146 BC, after a series of wars and some clever diplomacy, Greece was firmly under Roman control. The Romans were like the ultimate collectors of the ancient world, snapping up territories and cultures like they were action figures. This wasn't just about land. It was about prestige, power, and of course, cold, hard cash. But here's the rub. Managing all these new territories was like trying to herd cats. Each province came with its own set of laws, languages, and customs. Rome needed a system, and fast. Enter provincial governance. They started appointing governors, or praetors, to oversee these regions. Now, these governors were often the kind of folks who make modern politicians look like saints. They were given a free hand, provided they kept the tax money flowing back to Rome. Corruption? Oh, absolutely. The kind of backroom deals that would make a mob boss blush. You bet. The expansion also meant that the Roman military was spread thinner than a Roman pizza crust. Recruiting became a challenge, and the legions were often filled with non-citizens eager for a shot at Roman citizenship, a carrot that came with a very long stick attached. But despite these challenges, Rome continued to thrive. The Republic was transforming into a juggernaut, a force that seemed unstoppable. Yet, with great power comes even greater bureaucracy. The Senate had its hands full, trying to keep the provinces in line while juggling domestic issues back home. The logistics of running such a vast empire were staggering. Communication was slow. It wasn't like they could just shoot a quick email to the provinces. Messengers on horseback were the order of the day, and decisions made in Rome could take weeks, sometimes months, to reach the farthest corners of the empire. And let's not forget the cultural impact. Roman culture spread like wildfire, but so did the cultures of the conquered lands. Greek philosophy, art, and customs seeped into Roman life, influencing everything from architecture to religion. This was cultural appropriation on an epic scale, with Rome picking and choosing the best parts of each culture they absorbed. It's like they raided the ancient world's buffet, piling their plates high with whatever caught their fancy. So, while Rome's expansion brought wealth and power, it also brought complexity and chaos. The Republic was growing, but so were the cracks in its foundation. The political system, designed for a city-state, was being stretched to its limits. The balancing act between the Senate, the military, and the governors was becoming increasingly precarious. And as the Republic continued to expand, the seeds of internal conflict were quietly being sown. The power struggles, the corruption, and the social tensions were simmering beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to explode. But that, dear listener, is a tale for another time. For now, we've got a republic that's more like an empire in all but name, a senate with more on its plate than it can handle, and a society that's as complex as it is fascinating. So buckle up, because in the world of ancient Rome, the real drama is just getting started. Speaking of drama just getting started, let's talk about the elephant, or rather, the elephant-sized ambition, in the room. The rise of powerful generals who decided that Rome's Senate was more of a suggestion box than a governing body. Enter Julius Caesar, a name that would echo through history like the world's most famous mic drop. But before we get to Caesar's grand entrance, let's set the stage for why Rome was ripe for a shake-up. By the late Republic, Rome was like a teenager who hit a growth spurt overnight. Suddenly, what fit just fine yesterday, like its government structures and social norms, felt about 2 sizes too small. The Senate, originally designed to handle the affairs of a city-state, now found itself trying to manage an empire that stretched from Hispania, modern Spain, to Asia Minor. It was like trying to run the world's largest corporation with a board of directors who thought email was cutting-edge technology. And here's where things get really juicy: the economic disparities. While Rome's elite were busy counting their denarii and throwing lavish parties that would put the Met Gala to shame, the average Roman citizen was struggling to keep up. Landowners were buying up vast estates worked by slaves, pushing small farmers out of business and into the crowded cities. The urban poor swelled in numbers, and with bread prices more volatile than a Roman chariot race, you can bet tensions were high. Enter the generals. These guys were the rock stars of the Roman world, complete with their own legions of adoring fans, literally. They commanded armies that were more loyal to them than to the Senate, and in the cutthroat world of Roman politics, that was the ultimate trump card. Take Gaius Marius, for example, who reformed the Roman army by recruiting landless citizens and promising them land in return for their service. It was a clever move, and it set a precedent that generals could leverage military success into political power. But the man who really took this to the next level was none other than Julius Caesar. Born in 100 BC to a patrician family, Caesar had ambition in spades. He knew how to work a crowd, whether it was on the battlefield or in the Senate. His military campaigns in Gaul, think modern France and Belgium, were nothing short of legendary. Over 8 years, from 58 to 50 BC, Caesar expanded Roman territory by around 640,000 square kilometers, and claimed victory in battles that made him a hero among his troops and a household name back in Rome. Here's where the myth and reality start to diverge. The romantic version of Caesar paints him as a visionary leader with charisma to light up the Colosseum. And sure, he had charm, but he also had a knack for political maneuvering that would make Machiavelli blush. His famous crossing of the Rubicon in 49 BC was more than just a dramatic gesture. It was a declaration of war against the Senate. The phrase, crossing the Rubicon, has come to symbolize passing the point of no return, but let's be clear. Caesar wasn't just burning bridges, he was building a highway to absolute power. The Senate, predictably, was less than thrilled. They declared Caesar an enemy of the state, and Rome was plunged into a civil war that would make any modern political scandal look like a playground squabble. But here's the kicker. Caesar had the loyalty of his legions and the support of the people, who saw him as a champion of their cause against the corrupt elite. And while the Senate had plenty of rhetoric, they lacked the one thing Caesar had in spades, an army ready to back him up. The war ended with Caesar's victory at the Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BC. His rival, Pompey, fled to Egypt where he met a rather unfortunate end. Let's just say the Egyptians didn't exactly roll out the red carpet for him. With Pompey out of the picture, Caesar returned to Rome as a hero, and the Senate, realizing they were out of options, appointed him dictator. Now, being a dictator in Rome wasn't supposed to be a permanent gig. It was more like a temporary contract to sort things out during a crisis. But here's where Caesar flipped the script. In 44 BC, he declared himself dictator perpetuo, dictator for life. If that sounds like a recipe for trouble, well, you'd be right. The Senate, or at least those not in Caesar's pocket, started to get twitchy. The idea of one man holding that much power was enough to make even the most stoic senator sweat through his toga. Meanwhile, economic disparities were feeding the flames of discontent. The wealth from Rome's conquests was piling up in the hands of the few, while the common folks were left to scrounge for crumbs. Political corruption was rampant, with senators more interested in lining their own pockets than addressing the needs of the Republic. The social fabric of Rome was unraveling faster than you could say, veni, vidi, vici. It was against this backdrop that 60 senators decided enough was enough. On the Ides of March, 44 BC, they took matters and daggers into their own hands. Caesar's assassination was meant to save the Republic, but instead it threw Rome into even deeper chaos. The conspirators hadn't counted on Caesar's popularity with the people or the power vacuum his death would create. Enter the second triumvirate, Mark Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus. These three men divided the Roman world among themselves, but as you might expect, sharing power wasn't exactly their strong suit. Antony and Octavian soon found themselves at odds, leading to another round of civil wars. Octavian, who would later be known as Augustus, emerged victorious and became Rome's first emperor. The Republic was officially toast, and the Roman Empire was born. But before we wrap this up, it's worth noting that the transition from Republic to Empire wasn't just a switch in titles. It was a seismic shift in how Rome was governed. The Senate still existed, but its power was a shadow of what it once was. The emperor held the real power, and Rome's governance became more centralized. Yet, for all the chaos and bloodshed, the shift to empire brought a relative peace known as the Pax Romana. It was a time of prosperity and stability, but also one where the idea of liberty took on a new meaning. The Republic, with all its flaws and political machinations, was a distant memory, a romantic ideal that would inspire political thinkers for centuries to come. So, there you have it, the dramatic transformation of Rome from a republic struggling to keep up with its own growth into an empire that would dominate the ancient world. But don't close the history book just yet. The story of Rome is far from over, and the twists and turns of this ancient soap opera are bound to keep us on the edge of our seats. Stay tuned, because if you thought this was wild, the next chapter is set to up the ante. And so, as Rome's story unfolded like the most dramatic saga ever penned, we find ourselves at a turning point, one where the curtain falls on the Republic and rises on the Roman Empire. But how did this grand transition sneak by without sparking a massive revolt among the citizens? Enter Augustus, the ultimate spin doctor of antiquity. Augustus, born Gaius Octavius in 63 BC, was Julius Caesar's great-nephew and adopted son. After the dust settled from the civil wars, he emerged as the sole ruler of Rome in 27 BC. Here's the kicker. Augustus was astute enough to know that while Romans were tired of the chaos, they still cherished the idea of their beloved republic. So, rather than strutting in with a crown, Augustus rebranded the whole concept of dictatorship as something more palatable. He called it the Principate. The title of Princeps, or First Citizen, sounded humble, but let's be real, it was a masterclass in rebranding. Augustus was to the Republic what a facelift is to a midlife crisis. While Augustus played the role of a modest leader, behind the scenes, he held all the strings. His power was neatly packaged in titles like Imperator and Pontifex Maximus, which gave him control over the military and religious life. By maintaining the facade of republican traditions, he kept the Senate in the loop, albeit on a very short leash. They could debate and discuss all they wanted, but the real decisions were made elsewhere. It was like giving your cat a steering wheel. Sure, it looks like they're driving, but you're the one hitting the gas. The average Roman citizen, meanwhile, was likely too preoccupied with the newfound stability to question the change. After years of civil war, the Pax Romana, an era of relative peace that lasted about 200 years, must have been a welcome relief. Bread was back on the tables, the gladiatorial games offered entertainment, read, distractions, and the economy was thriving like a vineyard in the sun. Rome was bustling with around 1 million inhabitants, making it the New York City of its day, minus the skyscrapers and yellow cabs. Economically, Augustus implemented reforms that boosted trade and infrastructure. He famously claimed to have found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. Public works, roads, and aqueducts flourished, and he established a standing army and the Praetorian Guard to ensure that peace was more than just a marketing slogan. The Roman coinage system was standardized, which sounds boring until you realize it was the economic equivalent of inventing the internet. Suddenly, everyone was speaking the same financial language, but let's not sugarcoat it. Augustus was no saint. His reign saw ruthless purges of enemies, real and imagined. The poet Ovid was exiled for reasons that remain as mysterious as the contents of a politician's tax return. Augustus's moral reforms were as much about control as they were about virtue. Legislation on marriage and family was more big brother than big love. And while he claimed to restore the Republic, in truth, he laid the groundwork for an empire that would last over 400 years in the West and almost 500 in the East. So, what about the legacy of the Roman Republic? For centuries, it was hailed as the epitome of liberty. But let's be honest, it was a bit like idolizing a rock star with a notorious past. The Republic was built on a foundation of aristocratic privilege and political maneuvering. The romantic notion of a government by the people, for the people, was more myth than reality. The real Republic was a place where power was concentrated in the hands of a few, and the Senate was often more interested in infighting than governance. Yet, the influence of the Roman Republic on modern governance is undeniable. Its ideas about checks and balances, the separation of powers, and civic duty have inspired political systems around the globe. The United States, for example, borrowed heavily from Roman concepts when crafting its own constitution. The Senate, the veto, and the idea of a republic itself are echoes of Rome's political experiments. In the end, the story of Rome is a tale of ambition and innovation, of ideals both noble and flawed. The Republic laid the intellectual groundwork for political thought, while the Empire demonstrated the power of centralized control. Augustus's ability to repackage dictatorship as a principate shows us the timeless art of political branding, how perception often trumps reality. So, as we close the chapter on this grand narrative, remember that history is never a straightforward tale. It's a tapestry woven with the threads of human ambition, folly, and ingenuity. The Roman Republic may have fallen, but its spirit, complex, conflicted, and captivating, continues to shape our understanding of governance and power. And that, dear listener, is why the tale of Rome, with all its twists and turns, will never truly fade into history's shadows.